Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
In the morning, Susan felt better physically, but her mental state was terrible, and as if to make it worse, an investigator came to her room. "I need to interview you." "It won't take long. Don't worry. I'm told you're feeling better. There's nothing further threatening your health." Easy for him to say. How can a man understand the condition of a woman who's lost a child? And the investigator continued, "The doctors told us that there is a poison in your body, quite rare. Accidentally, it could not get into your body, and in connection with this, I must ask a few questions. 1. Do you have any enemies?" It all started as a long-awaited happiness with a rare celebration, a reunion of high school friends, 20 years after graduation. As it happened, Susan had never seen many of her classmates after graduation. Their school was in the old neighborhood, and just by the 10th grade, the families of many of the boys and girls got new apartments and moved away. Graduating class, some of them had already traveled from the new neighborhoods almost across town. And after graduation, Susan's family left, and a new life began, and institute new friends. First years, Susan longed for her native places, came to visit those who stayed to live in the old house, and in the school somehow came, but then it was not to that, and other attachments appeared. And now, as an adult, an established woman, she was going to meet, in fact, with her childhood and youth, and as she secretly admitted to herself, with her first love. Although there was no love, that is, romance such as in old movies show, she and Sebastian, the first handsome man of the class, and not only. They did not walk hand in hand, did not kiss furtively in the public garden, under a lilac bush. Alas, all this was only in Susan's dreams. In reality, there were only her bitter tears in her pillow, because her beloved did not pay any attention to her. That is, he did, when it was necessary to make her laugh, to embarrass her in front of his friends. By graduation, she couldn't tell if she loved Sebastian or hated him. And after graduation, they never saw each other again, which Susan was happy about, although there was still a void in the place of that failed first high school love. Would he come or not? Susan thought, getting ready for the meeting. And what had he become? Was he married? "I thought he was going to law school." "No, I'm not going to talk to Sebastian about my long-lost love, and I don't hope that we'll be able to make something work now." "Oh, I'm just curious. And not just about him, but about a lot of other people. There's Kevin. He seemed to have a crush on me. Kept looking at me in class. Or is it the obnoxious John? I hope he doesn't show up at all. Although I hear he married our first honors student. How interesting it would be to find out about everyone, who became who, how they changed, what they look like." Susan herself could not boast of success in her personal life, no husband, no children. In this, of course, is not the slightest fault of that Sebastian. She had much stronger crushes. There were also relationships, but it did not lead to anything. And not because of the fact that Susan something was wrong, not the beauty of her fate did not deprive her, not mind, and the character was golden, but first she wanted to finish the institute and studied very seriously. Her father by that time has already very seriously engaged in business and believed that the only daughter will be his best assistant. And while I wait for you to marry a good man, and even take, you will find a poor man. Don't sulk. I'm just kidding, but every joke has its own joke. Don't trust anyone, and in general, go ahead and learn it yourself." Susan studied well, without any encouragement, and her father's words motivated her even more. Her father relies on her, considers her capable of continuing his life's work, and his daughter did not want to disappoint him. So the search, at least a poor man, at least a reliable assistant, were postponed for later, after graduation. But barely had time to graduate from the institute as my mother fell ill. That is, she may be ill much earlier, but she never admitted it, much less complained. Quiet, modest woman, she used to live in the shadow of her bright, loud-voiced husband, strictly takes care of the house and relatives. Any indisposition, even a slight runny nose of her husband or daughter, led her to despair, forced her to develop vigorous activity to save the sick. And her fatal disease Procaroli Valley hid and from relatives and from themselves, and only when, apparently, it became unbearable, went to the doctor, but it did not hide. Even when she was diagnosed, urgently hospitalized, she did not talk about why she would have to leave home for the first time, perhaps, for the first time. It was nothing. Just a checkup, a week or two at the beach, and that's it. She comforted her daughter. You just take care of your daddy. I showed you where the chamomile tea is for him. Make it. He's got a stomach and eat right. Don't go to my place. I'm well fed there. I don't need anything. Of course, Susan called the information desk the same day to find out her mother's condition and was struck dead by the response of the woman on duty. Oncology ward, go ahead. The next day, they went to the hospital with her father, both to see her mom and to talk to the doctor. His words were even more horrifying. How could the disease be so neglected? If only she had gone to the hospital a year earlier. It's already stage 4. Of course we'll start treatment, and don't be so frightened. Hope for the best, but she never complained about anything. Father was breaking his fingers. I beg you, I'll sell everything for any money, just so long as she's alive. She doesn't complain now. On the contrary, she's eager to go home, and we'll probably discharge her soon. You'll continue your treatment at home. Money can't solve everything. Moreover, I will tell you that it will not always help. Don't throw away that money, and don't torture the patient. It's her optimism that gives me hope, and it may be the best medicine. Susan and her dad walked out of his office, wobbling with grief. Couldn't Mom be helped? They tried to cheer up in front of the room, but Mommy, as always, understood everything from their faces. Well, I told you not to come. You're just scared for nothing. How could you not be scared? I can see they're both turning green. Look at all the really sick people lying here. And what about me? Yes, I'll be discharged one day and everything will be the same. And in this hospital, I agree, the air alone would make any healthy person sick. And discharged her discharged. But what is there still? A terrible disease, every day changed Mom, took away from her strength, did not allow to hide her condition. At home she was treated, faithfully took medication, even said that she was getting better. But what better? A year later she collapsed. Susan had to quit her job, learn to be a nurse, a caregiver. Well, it's all for the best. If something happens, and you know how to give first aid and give a shot, my mom used to joke, although God forbid that these skills are needed. Be well, both of you, may you be well. Don't cry, my daughter. I'm not saying I'm dying. These pills are making me feel better. I'm sleeping very well, and I'm completely healthy in my sleep. But not in her sleep. Mom melted away and died 2 years later. Her father's grief prevented Susan from mourning her mother. She began to fear for his condition. Always cheerful, active, not discouraged, he seemed to be deprived of the necessary nourishment. His wife's illness and on him and affected him not in the best way, and her death in general turned not old yet a man into a weeping weak old man, with shaking hands. How is it, my daughter? How come we didn't keep our mommy safe? Every now and then, he said. How can we live now, my dear? Susan was afraid that her father would seek solace in alcohol. But no, he didn't need it. He always looked like a drunk. Her daughter tried to bring him back to work, realizing that it was the only way to save her, but her father was no longer interested in anything. He went to work, frightening the employees with changes in his appearance and behavior, and Susan was already doing all the work. No matter what question or advice she asked her father, the answer was the same. "What difference does it make, Susan? Do what you want. You can't get your mom back. Then what's the point of all this?" In the end, Susan called a doctor. A person can't just melt from longing like sugar in boiling water. It turned out that in addition to depression, the father has a serious heart problem. A year later, after the death of his beloved wife, and father died, exhausted, as everyone who was aware of what was happening said. Susan became the sole owner and manager of the entire business. True, there were some kind-hearted people who wanted to become co-owners of the partners. What's a girl to do with a load like that on her own? "You'll ruin your father's business," they told her. But Susan wasn't such a girl. She was already 26, and for the last few years, she'd been carrying everything on her own, and she'd managed very successfully. On the other hand, they started coming around. "You need to get married. A year or two more and you'll be an old maid. Marry a reliable man, have a baby. That's your woman's business, and a husband can handle the business." They began to bring her grooms, and this Susan, completely disgusted from the thought of the need to arrange their own fate. Maybe among those young and adult men were worthy, maybe even dreaming of a relationship and marriage, but also about the company too in each. She saw some mercantile interest and recoiled with fear. She could not give her father's business in the wrong hands. And she herself did not want to become an annex to the firm. That's how she lived 10 years alone, not really burdened by loneliness. Well, yes, sometimes very much wanted to become, finally, the mother of the family, to take care not only of the business, but also of relatives. But with each passing year, the possibility of realizing this dream all weakened. Dreams remained. In them, she had both her children and her husband. And this husband more and more often acquired the features of Sebastian, unfulfilled love. That's why Susan was going to meet her former classmates, with excitement and anticipation of some changes. And in general, she wanted to unwind. Not so often happened in her life holidays. Yes, at work sometimes organized corporate parties. Sometimes she was invited to visit a few relatives. Her mother's cousin, her father's brother's family, that's all the fun. But what fun is there? At the corporate party, she is still the boss. You cannot relax completely. And relatives, you come like a holiday and everything is as it should be. The table is set, salads, baked chicken, homemade pickles, Napoleon cake, and talk. And I'm still waiting. Susan, when you and your fiancé come, or even your husband, I want to see your kids. Why are you shaking your head? It's time. You're over 30. What are you waiting for? You've got your beauty and your mind. Who else is going to be married and bring up children? After such a holiday, you go home with an unpleasant feeling, although you realize that the aunt wished you well and spoke sincerely. But who needs the sincerity? And here, after all, there was a meeting with those whom she had known many years ago as children, and now she was to see them as adults, but also to show herself and boast of her successes. Because Susan believed that not only family is the most important thing in a person's life. Yes, she is not married, but not because her 5 husbands left her, and she alone now brings up 5 children, and not because no one needs her. She may have other interests and other achievements, and not a small one, because in her business life she succeeded, and she looked very good. I remembered how my aunt sometimes sighed at the TV. I wonder how people age differently. That artist. We're the same age, for God's sake. Yes, she's 2 months younger than me, but you'd think she's 20 years younger. They're like dragonflies, and sometimes I can barely crawl. Well, you compared our life and theirs. Her husband consoled her. What about my life? I did not carry stones, and she not only vacationed at resorts. They have artists. Life is not sugar, too. Touring, rehearsals, all sorts of travel, and that not to mention the nerves. It's just that you can marry her, but I'm in a home for invalids. Tell me too, and who are you going to marry, bride? Uncle was joking. Jokes are jokes, but we must think about what Susan should wear tonight. Maybe, of course, in a simple, youthful way, in jeans and a sweater. They're high school friends, but they're not high school friends anymore. And his business suit is also not an option, not a business meeting, besides want to relax. For the same reason 2 fancy outfits are not suitable, not a fashion show after all, and she is not a model. It is necessary to dress smart, beautiful, but not flashy. She's not going to arouse envy either, and in whom? Her classmates? They had a good class, no marginalized people. No one became a media personality either. There are no artists, writers, or any other celebrities, so she has to look accordingly. Although Susan, it must be admitted, has achieved more than many. Yes, she has something to be proud of, but she is not going to show her superiority. She chose a beautiful dress, but not provocative. She also did her hair herself, quite restrained, with jewelry is not overdone, and was ready for the exit. The gathering of those wishing to take part was appointed at school in the assembly hall, and on the way to the school, a petite beauty rushed up to her. "Susan, you? Oh, you look gorgeous. You're so beautiful, and what a car. My husband dropped me off and left. What an asshole," chirped dull beauty, in which Susan easily recognized a former classmate. "Cindy, I'm so glad to see you're still so dainty." "No, I've grown 2 mosquito heads." Susan laughed happily. She was really happy to see the smallest girl of their class and to hear her doll-like voice. "Who's coming over there?" "Oh, is that James Clark? He put a frog in my briefcase in 6th grade, so I'm gonna get back at him. I think that's Molly and Robert. They got married. We have 4 couples. Can you believe it? Come on, let's go." Finally, everyone was gathered, seated in the auditorium, and the former students were greeted by the teachers who had grown old and sweet. It is even strange that 20 years ago someone was afraid of them, someone frankly disliked them. Also classmates, what kind of good grown-up people have all become? It's hard to imagine that once these same people were nasty, mischievous, and fought. Susan looked around furtively, but Sebastian was gone. One of the girls suddenly pulled out a thick notebook that looked familiar to many. "Look what I have here. This is the questionnaire that everyone here filled out in 10th grade. Let's remember what we were like 20 years ago, what we dreamed of, and who had what come true." Everyone leaned over the notebook with interest, hardly recognizing their youthful revelations. They regretted that most of the questions were not so interesting and important now. Well, who cares what movie I liked back then? Here, let's talk about who wanted to accomplish what. Here's Cindy. I want to be loved and be loved. Did it come true? It came true. I divorced my first husband, but through no fault of my own. It was a mistake, but I'm happy now. My second husband and I have true love and a beautiful daughter. Kelly, you wanted to be a kindergarten teacher. Did it work out? Unfortunately, no. At the insistence of my parents, I graduated from a technical college, but I don't work by profession. Only my own kindergarten. I had my third boy a year ago. Well, we'll make that count. Clara, a junior high school teacher, and how? Teacher, but high school. I'm trying to teach math to the same people we were recently. Even with the overachievement, well done. That's James, but there's a bit of a joke in there too. I want to be bold. I want to be brave. I want to rip your clothes off. Whose notebook is this? Yours, Lucy. You and James got married, and this one's a total hit. Now you're Susan. You're going to go to school and carry on your father's work? Yeah, I had to. Although if I'd written a couple years earlier, it wouldn't have been the same. But look at everyone else's writing. But Sebastian, I'll be a judge, and then you'll be on your own. Joker. Where is he, by the way? He's not here, but he said he'd be here. I called him. I heard from one of Sebastian's old friends. There he is. There he is. Cindy shouted triumphantly. Remember what the punishment for tardies used to be? Scrubbing the floors after class. But we don't have class today. Laughing, Sebastian, who showed up later than everyone else, shook hands, hugging, recognizing his grown-up friends. Susan stood up to meet him too, and for Sebastian it was as if everyone around him had disappeared. He was looking at her with that look she had longed for in the past, but now what? Now it's a grown, respectable man, probably married. That's why he was late. Probably asking for his wife, I guess. Hello, Sebastian, she said to break the stupor. Or what should I call you now? Your Honor? No, my dream didn't come true, although I became a lawyer. True, now without a job, just left the firm where I worked for 10 years. I just realized that there will be no development there. So I don't know what title I'll be honored with yet. And you and Susan, your ladyship now, you must be glowing. I won't be offended if you call me that. Susan laughed. She wanted to remind him how he had called her names in childhood, but she bit her tongue. There was no need to spoil such a wonderful evening. Meanwhile, the festive part was over. Everyone moved to the banquet hall, where the conversation became more lively. Then the dancing began. Sebastian, of course, invited Susan, and more than once. She, remembering that she was driving, refused alcohol, but she still felt drunk with happiness, back to the days of her long-gone youth. Her dream had come true. It was Sebastian who held her in his arms, her gently spinning head resting on his shoulder. After such a wonderful encounter, would they have to part again? He whispered compliments, spoke of his admiration, but nothing more. Susan already knew that Sebastian was not married, but apparently he didn't need her either. At the end of the evening, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Sebastian, take my card. Call me if there's anything wrong with the job. My old lawyer at my firm just quit 6 months ago. I hired a young one, 3 years out of college, you know. So I'm looking for someone more experienced. You're always welcome. And shortly after that evening, a new lawyer arrived at Susan's firm. To the great displeasure of the previous one, Alvin Togo was not fired, but was made Sebastian's assistant. The young man, also very smart, did not quit, but no one knew the true reasons. He stayed with the firm, having received, whatever you say, a demotion, not because he was afraid of being out of work. Good lawyers everywhere are worth their weight in gold. The reason was much deeper and more serious. Alvin was secretly in love with Susan. But it never occurred to her, but what kind of love would that be? The guy was 12 years younger than her, and small signs of attention, like the appearance of fresh flowers on her desk, a cup of her favorite coffee for lunch, she attributed it to the subtle courtesy shown by colleagues, and maybe Alvin himself, but only out of respect. Sebastian, however, began to court her quite openly, which delighted Susan. He did not seem to be burdened with loneliness, that is, she managed to convince herself of it. In fact, what are the difficulties of a single, but quite well-to-do, in addition, a city woman? There is no mowing in the city, as it was written in some book, and physical help was not needed. But lonely evenings, what is it like? Especially for a young, beautiful woman striving for an active and interesting life. Especially after 30, it became difficult. At first, Susan, demonstrating independence, boldly went alone to the theater, concerts, exhibitions. It seems that such events do not go to socialize with gentlemen, but alone turned out to be painful. One to come, at intermissions to sit in the hall, crumpling in his hand program, one to leave, and no one will not help to take off your coat, no one then will not get it in the check room, will not serve. Everyone goes in pairs and is so alert, attentive to their companions, but she is alone. No one to talk to on the way home, to discuss what we've seen and heard. No, it is better to sit at home, though alone, but no one knows it. And if we don't respond to the phone calls, then maybe they'll think that Susan's gone on a bender. So what? A woman is lonely. Take a walk, take a walk. For the same purpose, she sometimes bought herself flowers, and on ordinary weekdays returned with bouquets. Let them think she wasn't lonely. What she didn't want most of all was to be pitied. And now she had the opportunity, if not to walk, then to walk, just to come out of her shell. Rarely a day Sebastian didn't invite her to a restaurant, theater, or some other cultural event. And if they did without it, they just walked the streets and talked. So much news has accumulated over the past 20 years. That is not news anymore. But that's for whom, how? They had to get reacquainted. They didn't talk about their school past. Unfortunately, there was nothing to talk about. Susan confessed that she was in love with him and resented his relationship. Yes, I was a fool, but honey, don't you realize I was head over heels in love? I didn't know how to express it. A lot of guys do that. Teasing, pulling pigtails. First grade, yeah, but 10th grade? But enough about that. It's funny to take offense at things that happened long ago. I mean, really, now that we're together, I can make it up to you, right? I guess so. And I guess I'm finally happy. Susan felt happy for the first time, and so did Sebastian, who was not only winning Susan's heart, he was almost the boss of the company. Not even a year later, the owner had written a general power of attorney for him, which meant that he had full control over all matters and finances. To the chief accountant's somewhat perplexed question, Susan replied, "What's the big deal? Sebastian is already fully aware of everything, and he and I are getting married. Yes, the application has been filed, and we're getting married in a month." The news traveled around the firm. Someone rejoiced for the lonely to this boss, although some, of course, admired the dexterity of the young man. And there was one person who was truly saddened by this news. Alvin. He still held the position of paralegal and was sitting idle more and more often, Sebastian less and less often privy to his affairs. It frustrated and annoyed the young man, but for the time being, he was dying to be near the woman he loved. Perhaps he hoped for reciprocity, that someday he would be able to confess his feelings to Susan. But realizing that Sebastian had beaten him to it, he wrote a statement and went to his boss to sign it. Upon reading the application, Susan raised her eyebrows. "What's the matter?" "Everyone seems to be happy with your work. And that's why I don't have a job, in fact. And anyway, I can't work forever as a junior assistant to the head janitor. Can I? I've got to develop myself. Well, I can't keep you." Susan was indeed a little sad that this young man would be leaving the firm, but not for personal reasons. For her, there were no men other than Sebastian. Alvin was simply a competent and promising lawyer, not at all superfluous in his position. But she signed the application and said goodbye to the young man warmly, writing him a solid bonus for good work. A month later, there was a gorgeous wedding of Sebastian and Susan. Happy newlyweds received congratulations from colleagues and relatives, rejoiced at the changes in their lives, and sincerely believed that their happiness will not end. A few days after the wedding, they went on a wedding trip to a fashionable resort. How wonderful to be happy! Susan exulted quietly. And just to have a vacation from everything in the world except love. I haven't had a normal vacation in all these years, it seems, so I took a week sometimes to sleep. And then suddenly I have the sea, the sun, and you. You are my sea and sun. Sebastian replied, I swear from now on you'll be on vacation like this, several times a year. Alone? Susan pouted. And who will stay in the shop? Sebastian laughed back. It's such an inconvenience to work together, and with such responsibility. We're sunbathing here, and they're already dismantling everything. I've got a 100 times tested team. You don't have to worry about that, but a few vacations a year, I agree. It's not gonna happen, and together. Well, we'll see. I mean, our happiness is just beginning, right? It really was. After returning from vacation, the couple started working with renewed vigor. Susan had one more wish, though, and that was children. And she was aware of the fact that there was not much time left for its realization. The years were flying by so quickly. She herself did not really believe that she would be able to become a mother, and therefore she did not share her dreams even with her husband. And at the end of the first year of marriage, when she first felt some unusual ailment, did not immediately suspect what was obvious, and certainly did not share her suspicions with anyone but a doctor, a gynecologist from a private clinic whose services she had been using for many years, and there the best suspicions were justified. After a comprehensive examination, the doctor congratulated her on the fact that in 7 months the baby would be born and was surprised by the woman's reaction. She ducked her face into the palms of her hands and cried, "What is it?" "Are you not happy?" surprised the doctor. "I am happy. I just can't believe my happiness. I'm 40 years old. Isn't it too late? Am I giving my baby everything he needs? Well, as long as it's in me. Will my body be able to handle it? What are you worried about? If you'd had a baby every year or a dozen abortions, but you haven't. Your body's been preparing for this event, and as far as I know, it's gonna be fine. Probably more than once. So you can go home and make your husband happy. I hope it's good news for him, too. I bet he will, because we're the same age, and he and I have never had children before." On the way home, however, Susan decided to hold off a bit on the happy news. She and Sebastian would have their first wedding anniversary in a week's time, a very appropriate occasion to announce it during the celebration, for now they would have to rejoice alone. However, that joy was suddenly overshadowed by a call from an old friend. "Susan, I'm sorry if I'm upsetting you, but I think you should know this. I was walking downtown today, and I was shopping, and as I was walking past the restaurant, you know, the one next to the shoe store, it has these big windows. So, through the window I saw your Sebastian at one of the tables, and he was not alone, but with a very interesting blonde. Thank you. How much do I owe you for this information?" Susan said dryly, "I knew I'd be left to my own devices. It's my fault. My friend was upset. I believe my husband. It must have been a business meeting. He has to meet with his partners a lot. I do not know if with business partners are accepted so cooing, then of course, what can I understand in it?" A friend interrupted the call, and immediately sent some photos. On them was Sebastian. He was really sitting at a table in a restaurant, tenderly holding the hand of a beautiful girl. They smiled at each other. It didn't look much like a business meeting. Susan felt the blood drain from her face. To poison a happy day like this. Though yes, what did a girlfriend have to do with it? But Sebastian can't be cheating on me either. Surely there was a simple explanation. In the evening, she without further ado laid out her phone in front of her husband, with those very photos, and looked questioningly at her lover. And with growing horror saw that Sebastian became nervous. He was clearly confused, did not know what to say, then asked sadly, "Are you spying on me? I didn't think you would stoop to such a thing. It would not have occurred to me. It was an acquaintance decided to open my eyes on your pastime. Congratulations. You have very observant friends. I envy their husbands. Except they didn't do you a favor. They ruined your anniversary surprise. In the restaurant My Soul, I was dining with a client and his lawyer, this very girl. The client left, and I stayed with her. The girl, as you can see, is young, doesn't understand much, so I tried. No, not to deceive her, but to turn the case in our favor, you know? And it's gonna be a very lucrative contract. If I manage to pull it off as planned, we will be able to rise very significantly. For several years we will be secured, you know? In a week's time, it'll all be up and running, as they say. I'll refrain from details, let a little bit of intrigue remain. As it is, I'll have to think of another present." Sebastian had a look of displeasure, a jokingly pouty look, and Susan, of course, melted. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I swear I didn't doubt you for a minute, but you know I had my doubts. By the way, I have a surprise for you, too. A very nice one, I promise." So they made up. Before they could quarrel, trust was restored. Each in his own way prepared for the celebration of the first anniversary of marriage, not realizing that there was a man living nearby who trusted Sebastian, every day less and less. It was Alvin. Yes, he had not forgotten Susan, the woman to whom he had never dared to hint his feelings, and the feelings remained, both for Susan and Sebastian. They were the exact opposite, though. Yes, Alvin disliked his colleague at first sight, which was not surprising, because Sebastian had displaced him in the place that Alvin considered his by right. Perhaps the more senior lawyer had more reason to claim the place, at least experience, but that was well understood from the outside. The appearance of Sebastian, whose relationship with Susan was no secret to anyone, was a serious defeat for Alvin, and an even more serious reason not to like or trust the man. Working together, he noticed some oddities, but there was nothing he could do about it. No one listened to him. After he found out that Susan was marrying Sebastian, Alvin realized that nothing further depended on him. Now he could do whatever he wanted. Suspect his enemy of the worst sins. It won't change anything. Susan loves him, and Alvin. Well, Alvin? At his existence, she simply forgot before the door closed behind him. You shouldn't have dragged it out so long. You could have confessed sooner and let it be. Let's say she'd have laughed in his face, thrown him out of sight. So what? That's how it ended anyway. But then I'd know I'd done everything I could. And she would know that I'm not just an inexperienced lawyer, but a man who loves her and would do anything for her. And this Sebastian, well, I've worked with him. I've seen that he's not exactly a star. I don't know what he will bring to the case to which Susan gives all of herself, but that's their problem. It doesn't concern me anymore. These were the thoughts that plagued Alvin for quite some time after his dismissal. Why did he procrastinate and delay his confession when he had the opportunity to see his beloved woman almost daily? He explained it to himself honestly and very simply. He was afraid. But what would it be like? He, having barely got a job, where he was taken, most likely, just for a trial period, for an internship, and suddenly begins to explain in love, and who, the owner of the company, his boss, chic, business, but older than him in age, and also much more wealthy. What would one think of a guy who would dare to make such a confession? Will Susan not be offended by such a courtship? If she does not even chase him away immediately, will Alvin not become a laughingstock? A quick boy, our shooter has been everywhere, and got position, and a woman not the least, and all the firm in addition. Isn't that the kind of whispers he heard behind his back? Here and waited that he could somehow show himself, to make an impression on his beloved. If she herself had looked at Alvin not just as an employee, but there were no signals from Susan in his direction. Alvin, of course, had found another job after his dismissal, and even enjoyed success not only as an aspiring but capable professional, but also as a single man. Single women and girls paid attention to him, tried to impress him. But how were they to know that he looked at each one by comparing it to another, and in his eyes all women lose to Susan? It didn't matter that they were younger and more suited to his age. It didn't matter that they were single. They weren't Susan, and strangely enough, Alvin hadn't given up hope of still achieving this grown married woman. That is, he assumed that now Sebastian would somehow negatively prove himself, and that it would happen. Alvin had no doubt. And one day he had a chance to find out something about his happy rival. When he was dealing with a fraud case at his new job, he unexpectedly came across a familiar surname, Sebastian. True, he was a witness, but clearly had a much more serious relationship to the case, just to prove nothing. Alvin could not understand the case of 5 years ago. He lacked materials, or maybe experience, but he was interested in the case. Not only interested, alarmed, for if all was as he supposed, Susan was already in danger. And who can help her if his suspicions about her husband, who had unlimited access to all the affairs and finances of the firm? Not only that, but Susan's own safety is at risk. Fearful pictures painted the young man's imagination. He remembered everything he knew about Sebastian originally, that is, what he had told about himself and his past. From his words, everything was great. Brilliantly graduated from the institute, internship abroad, 10 years of impeccable work in a solid firm. Sebastian spoke vaguely about his personal life, except that he hinted at some tragedy, which left a heavy mark. Well, to check all this is not difficult. The check was not in vain. Sebastian had certainly graduated from the institute. The diploma was genuine, but here are the grades in it. Yes, this graduate was far from a red diploma. But further on there was such a confusion that Alvin could not figure it out on his own. Realizing that he had reached a dead end, he turned to an old friend, whom he considered his teacher. He met with him and stated his request. The friend looked at the initial data, asked, "What's this? Alvin is a private detective, has decided to become a private detective. What's this Sebastian you're so interested in?" "Yes, there, William, rather personal interest is involved, but I want to expose the villain." "I mean, everything is a lie. And for what purpose? A good person could get hurt. That's what I don't want. A woman?" William winked. "Well, don't blush like a girl, you're young. I'll try to find out what's going on with this young man through my channels. It didn't look like much at first. You can expect anything from a guy like that." It took a lot of time to find out the whole background of Sebastian, but when a friend invited Alvin to the cafe to tell him about the question of interest, it became clear that the young man was worried not in vain. "What a fruit you gave me, Alvin. Next to him not only your good man, but as if you and yourself in danger was not. I'll tell you one thing, Your Sebastian didn't graduate from college for nothing. In the end, he learned to bury in a way that even Sterlitz would envy. So he worked after his studies in several firms and everywhere successfully, for his own pocket, but he almost always left like a goose out of water. Only at first, until he gained experience or the wrong people ran into, even to the court case came to court, but even there the snake got out of it. So, 3 bankruptcies thanks to his activities, and all so neatly with white gloves. That's what I thought. Alvin sighed. Yeah, wait a minute. Those aren't his biggest sins. Firms, okay, he ruined those, he screwed those, but it happens. What can you do? He's not only that, he's also very unscrupulous in personal matters, which I think is even worse. Was he married? Alvin asked coldly. I wish. I tried not to bring it to that, though I had one marriage, but it was when I was young. Then I looked for ladies, rich ones, by interest, and then I left them, having taken something especially valuable. Here you go. One of them took her own life, after he had left her without money and an apartment. Another ran around the courts, but never got anything, and another one. Well, it's a murky story. After she met our client, she disappeared into thin air. What a nightmare. But why isn't he still in jail? Why? In the business part, he got away with it, but in personal matters, yes, he loved, then fell out of love. And the fact that it made someone else want to live, and someone else ran away, that's not a question for him. Money jewelry? You can prove he took it. He's got nothing on him, naked as a falcon. That's it. He can get away with it now. It's all on the account of his common-law wife, who's a nobody. No one knows how much she got. And now what? Alvin agonized over how he could save Susan now. And now what? Now he's clean as a whistle. He's officially employed by a reputable firm, married to the owner of the firm. I wouldn't give a dime for her life right now. There's a woman walking on a cliff like that. Is she the reason you brought it up? Yeah, Susan, but they've been married a year. But he's been sitting tight. Now he's gonna make a move. If this Susan means anything to you, you're gonna have to go to the rescue. But how do I know if she'll want to be saved? Alvin muttered to himself. Yes, you forgot the main thing. You tell her that she is not the only one he has so-and-so. He has a few years already, as they say now, a common-law wife. Well, that is, he has been with her for a long time and firmly, apparently, they have not only personal, but also business reciprocity. This girl works in a pharmacy as a pharmacist. She hasn't been caught for anything yet, but who knows? So I'd recommend not sitting at the table with him, just in case. Here are the coordinates of this great love of his. Just in case, ask around, it might come in handy. She just bought a car, by the way. And I doubt that on her pharmacist's salary, she does not deny herself anything. Alvin thanked his friend and left the cafe, completely dumbfounded by the information he had received. What to do now? How to save Susan? First of all, he decided to collect evidence, and for the sake of this he made a small surveillance of Sebastian. Now he knew the address of this civilian mistress in labor. It was not difficult. Soon Alvin had pictures of Sebastian helping the girl out of the car, walking with her under his arm, kissing her tenderly near the entrance. But what to do with it next? Just show Susan around. Meet up and tell her everything I've learned? Ask her to be more careful? Any of those actions might not accomplish the desired goal, and they could easily antagonize Alvin, but it was dangerous to hesitate, and he couldn't help but agree with his friend. As a result, he decided to call his former boss and say that he knew something about her husband. I'm sure she'll agree to meet, and it'll be easier to get it all out in private. "Hello, Susan. This is Alvin, the lawyer you used to work for, remember?" "Of course, Alvin. Good afternoon." The woman wasn't exactly pleased, but she sounded friendly enough. "Oh, this is about to change. How can I put this delicately?" "I'd like to meet you, Susan. I have some information that might interest you." "What kind of information? Can you be more specific?" "The thing is, I'm running out of time, so I'd like to know how important it is." "Very important, and above all, for your safety. I'd like to tell you about your husband, Sebastian. Believe me, he's not quite who he says he is." "And who is he?" With a scornful sneer, Susan asked. "An American spy." "The Ussuri Tiger?" "Believe me, it's very serious." In a pleading tone, said Alvin, "I have proof." "What proof?" she interrupted. "The pictures?" "I've seen 100 of them. We have enough envious people besides you, but I didn't expect it from you." "A young man, educated, well-mannered. Are you still angry about being fired?" "No one fired you. You left on your own." "No, I didn't. That's not what I'm talking about, honestly. I'm begging you, why don't we meet?" "No, Alvin, I don't have time for meaningless meetings. I love my husband and trust him." "Do you think he loves you?" Alvin asked hopelessly. "I don't think, I know. And I'll ask you not to call me anymore. I don't have time. Besides, this kind of talk makes me worry. Have a good day." And Susan interrupted the call. "Why are we so unhappy? Unpleasant conversation?" Sebastian walked into the office without knocking. "I have to go to the bank to drop off some payments, so sign, Susan. You can do it yourself. Sebastian." Susan smiled strainedly as she signed the papers. "Come on, you're the landlady. So who was on the phone, Ethan? Is he asking for an extension again?" "No, Alvin, your predecessor. Imagine he hasn't been able to settle down for a year. Suddenly he says he's got some information about something. It's crazy, in a word. He's probably stoned out of his mind. Well, I'm off. See you tonight, my love. Do you really love me?" Susan smiled reassuringly. "What do you think? I told you this morning I couldn't have fallen out of love in a couple of hours. I won't fall out of love in 100 years. Sebastian ran away. Susan moistened her eyes. What kind of people are these? Someone else's happiness is worse than cholera to them. That's what they think, and Alvin, and that friend. That she'll divorce her husband after hearing their gossip? No way. She feels that Sebastian loves her. And tomorrow is their anniversary, which they decided to celebrate together, without any noise and noise, she herself insisted. After all this evening, she will tell her favorite the main news. They will have a child, and Sebastian will be happy. They'll wipe the noses of all envious people. Alvin, having finished that conversation, sat helplessly, biting his lip. No, he was not going to retreat, to leave the woman he loved without help and protection. Susan was in danger, but she was not yet able to realize it. She loved her husband like those other, deceived, robbed women. But he will do anything to ensure that Susan is spared such grief. Yes, having ascertained everything, she will probably suffer a lot, cry, but she will be alive and well, and Sebastian, the scoundrel, will get nothing. Better still, if it were possible to put him on trial, he deserves it. So he'll go to Susan's office now, tell her everything he's learned from William. He'll show the photos, suggest a trip to the house of Sebastian's mistress, and he'd better catch the scoundrel there too. And then the poor woman will have no choice but to believe what he says. Yes, most likely it will not add sympathy to Alvin himself, but there was no such sympathy. So let it all stay as it was, and maybe sometime later she would realize who the real friend really was. He thought hopefully. With such thoughts, Alvin and moved towards the office, hoping to catch Susan in place and alone, not always Sebastian hanging around. He was in a hurry, rehearsing in his mind the forthcoming speech, but Machine, as always, carefully watched the road. Alvin never broke traffic rules, and this time, coming to an unregulated crossing, he was sure that he had done everything right. He looked at the road, it was empty. But suddenly, when he reached the middle of the road, a foreign car almost silently came out of nowhere, and then there was a tearing pain and darkness. None of this Susan knew, of course. She was preparing to celebrate not only the anniversary of their life together, but also another, much more important event that only she knew about. It was decided to celebrate in a small, cozy restaurant, just the two of them. Susan, with a discreet glow, waited for the moment when she could tell her husband about her pregnancy. They ordered. Susan was very fond of different seafood. She ordered the pasta with ideas. While waiting to order, she couldn't resist pulling a pregnancy test out of her purse. And here was my anniversary surprise, and was unpleasantly surprised by her husband's reaction, the joyful anticipation on his face, suddenly replaced by bewilderment and fear. "What is this test? You mean you're pregnant?" he asked without any enthusiasm. "Are you not happy?" Susan was surprised. Now it was her turn to be scared. "Come on, honey." Sebastian pulled himself together. "I'm happy. It's just so sudden. That's why I was surprised." "Well, I'm happy, my dear." "Of course I'm happy. I thought you were frightened." The woman said, offended. "Who wouldn't be? We are no longer young. The emergence of a child, it is a risk, above all for you. It's such a strain on the body." "No, don't think so. I'm not discouraging you. I'm happy. It's just that at this stage, your health is more important to me than anything else." Sebastian's been very reassuring. "My health will be fine. Don't worry. I've already been to the doctor. Everything is fine. No complications are expected." "Well, thank God. Thank you for the good news on a day like this. I didn't expect it, really." The order came, but Susan went out first. She had to visit the ladies' room, and when she arrived, everything was ready. The couple began to celebrate. Not surprisingly, all the talk centered around Susan's pregnancy. "Is that why you ordered the juice? I was wondering why you wouldn't even have your favorite wine. You have to eat for two now, and you're right. Seafood is the best thing for the baby. Aren't you sick?" "Oh, come on, Sebastian." "It's okay, I told you. I'm just pregnant. It's no big deal." "Yeah, the flavor's different. I feel like every dish tastes unfamiliar." "Yeah, well, I've read about that. I don't know which book." This woman thought all the food was too bland. "Would you like some salt? Or would you like some seasoning?" "No, not at all." "Oh, I just said I was fine, and then I jinxed it. I feel dizzy and stuffy. Why don't you pay and let's eat?" "Wait, it's so nice here. Breathe deeply, drink some water. Or do you want a sip of wine? It won't hurt, but you'll feel better." No, I want to go home. Shall we eat?" "I don't feel well." Susan was already feeling very ill indeed, and was surprised that her husband, who had just been so concerned about her health, was sitting so indifferently, looking at her not sympathetically, but as if testing her. "Sit down, don't spoil the evening." In Sebastian's voice there was a cold chuckle, but his voice came out as if through absorbent cotton. Everything was blurring in front of her eyes. Susan tried to get up, but her legs buckled, and she fell as if she had dived into some suffocating blackness. An ambulance was called, and Susan was taken unconscious to the hospital, where she was immediately admitted to the intensive care unit. Only the next morning, the woman regained consciousness. She remembered everything, the restaurant, the seafood. "I'm sure she's poisoned. That's why I thought the flavor of those mussels was so weird. I'm gonna sue that restaurant. Oh my God, my baby." The doctor came in, checked her reactions, calmed her down. There's no further danger to her health. It was a serious poisoning, and you're lucky the doctors were called quickly and responded appropriately. And that you didn't drink alcohol, or they wouldn't have been able to save you in time. But your child was less fortunate. You unfortunately lost him. How? That can't be true. I needed that child so badly. Is it because of the Dan mussels? I'm afraid the mussels had nothing to do with it. The doctor shook his head. I have already informed the police. A rare and dangerous poison has been found in your stomach. When your condition stabilizes, an investigator will come to see you. What condition? What investigator? My baby. Oh my God, I've been waiting for him. And Sebastian? She realized. Is my husband here? Did he poison himself too? No, he didn't come. And I think he's fine. Don't worry. Susan had nothing to worry about. Her long-awaited child would never be born. Here's Sebastian. Why doesn't he come? Yeah, well, they probably just won't let him in the ICU. They'll move him to the ward and they'll see each other. She was transferred to the ward the next day, but the first thing that came was not her husband, but the investigator with his questions about whether she had any enemies. What enemies? Not the waiters, not the cooks. No one knew I was going to be in this restaurant. Susan exclaimed, and Sebastian suddenly stood before her eyes. He looked at her, questioningly, and urged her, "Have a sip of wine. Let's sit down. Don't spoil the evening." So he wanted to keep her in the restaurant, wanted to aggravate her condition? But that can't be. Sebastian is her husband. He loves her. He was happy about the baby. And what did Alvin say about the danger? Why does Sebastian not come? For if they saw each other, all doubts would be shattered. She felt sick again and interrupted the investigator with an irritated question. "Are you trying to get the restaurant workers off your back? It's clear that I poisoned myself with their seafood. It tasted weird to me right away. The remnants of the dish you didn't eat were sent for examination. They were found to contain poison." The investigator sighed. It had nothing to do with the mussels or the rest of the food. Susan dialed her husband's number, but he didn't answer. Probably busy or driving to my place. Hopefully, the woman thought. But Sebastian did not arrive, and his phone was subsequently turned off. There was no strength to think about what it meant. Her condition improved, but then again she felt sick and weak, depressed, and sometimes unable to get out of bed. Only after 2 weeks, Susan felt that she could get up, walk, live on. And everything would clear up with Sebastian, probably, because he couldn't have disappeared without a trace. She looked out the window. The weather was beautiful. I should at least go out to the garden, get some air. This atmosphere is making me feel worse, she thought. She sighed, smoothed her hair a little, smoothed her hospital gown, and cautiously went down the stairs. At the first moment, the fresh spring air almost drowned her out. Susan wanted to ask someone to walk her to her room, but changed her mind. "It's nothing, I'll just stand, breathe and come to my senses. I have to get used to the air of freedom and independence. There would be no one to pick me up from the hospital." She had already realized that Sebastian must have abandoned her. It was up to the investigators to determine how much he was to blame for what had happened. Susan did feel better, and she wandered slowly down the path, enjoying the rays of the sun, the pictures of waking nature. She didn't want to think about bad things, but nothing good came into her head, so she enjoyed the peace and thoughtlessness. The other patients were wandering the street, some alone, some apparently with relatives who had arrived. Suddenly her gaze caught on some familiar face, Alvin. It was he who strode hesitantly toward her, leaning on crutches, with his plastered leg out in front of him. She had been thinking of this young man recently. "Alvin?" Susan exclaimed. "How are you here?" The young man looked at her at first, as if not recognizing her. Then he perked up. "Susan, are you ill?" "I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you at first." "I am." He nodded at his leg. "Car accident, second day back on the road, learning a new means of transportation." "What about you?" "You've lost so much weight. And me, Alvin, I got poisoned." "You warned me, and I did." Talking to a man who looked at her kindly and sympathetically made her voice break. The tears themselves flowed from her eyes. "Come on, Susan. Let's sit down on the bench and tell me what happened." "Is it your husband?" "I don't know yet, Alvin." Sitting down on the bench, Susan replied, "The investigators are still looking into it, but judging by the fact that my husband hasn't shown up or called in 2 weeks, you were right. I understand the investigators can't find him either. They're on him though, right?" "That's good. Can you give me your investigator's cell phone number?" "Or he can have mine. I really need to talk to him. I already know something about your husband." "Yes, of course you do. I can't tell you anything. I'm so clumsy. Love is in my eyes, but he loves me. In the meantime, Alvin, tell me what you know. And one more thing. I'm sorry I didn't believe you that day. Who knows? If I'd agreed to see you, we'd both be well. No one can know that, but why don't we go to the ward or the lobby? It's getting fresh. You don't need a cold." They sat down in the lobby. Alvin began to tell everything he knew about Sebastian, about his previous jobs, about his relationships with women, and about the fact that he still had a mistress. "A friend told me he's an investigator. He found out everything. I was horrified. I rushed to you. That is, I called you first, but it's clear that you didn't believe me. I thought I'd come and show you the photos. Although you said you'd already seen it all, but everyone can't lie, especially since the investigator was here. So it's already a fact. Now I don't know what to believe anymore. I wish none of this ever happened, including the meeting with Sebastian. Then why did I go to that high school friend's night? Tell me something else. Why did you find out about Sebastian? Did you have something against him? Or did you find out something bad before? Before? Before I knew you, Susan, I fell in love with you. Don't you get it?" Alvin finally decided to speak up. "Yes, at first sight and forever. Now I'm cursing myself for not admitting it sooner. I mean, I should have quit my job first, and then I should have confessed, wooed, pursued. And then maybe there wouldn't have been a Sebastian. It's nothing, I'll just stand, breathe and come to my senses. I have to get used to the air of freedom and independence. There would be no one to pick me up from the hospital." She had already realized that Sebastian must have abandoned her. It was up to the investigators to determine how much he was to blame for what had happened. Susan did feel better, and she wandered slowly down the path, enjoying the rays of the sun, the pictures of waking nature. She didn't want to think about bad things, but nothing good came into her head, so she enjoyed the peace and thoughtlessness. The other patients were wandering the street, some alone, some apparently with relatives who had arrived. Suddenly her gaze caught on some familiar face, Alvin. It was he who strode hesitantly toward her, leaning on crutches, with his plastered leg out in front of him. She had been thinking of this young man recently. "Alvin?" Susan exclaimed. "How are you here?" The young man looked at her at first, as if not recognizing her. Then he perked up. "Susan, are you ill?" "I'm sorry. I didn't recognize you at first." "I am." He nodded at his leg. "Car accident, second day back on the road, learning a new means of transportation." "What about you?" "You've lost so much weight. And me, Alvin, I got poisoned." "You warned me, and I did." Talking to a man who looked at her kindly and sympathetically made her voice break. The tears themselves flowed from her eyes. "Come on, Susan. Let's sit down on the bench and tell me what happened." "Is it your husband?" "I don't know yet, Alvin." Sitting down on the bench, Susan replied, "The investigators are still looking into it, but judging by the fact that my husband hasn't shown up or called in 2 weeks, you were right." "I understand the investigators can't find him either." "They're on him though, right?" "That's good. Can you give me your investigator's cell phone number? Or he can have mine. I really need to talk to him." "I already know something about your husband." "Yes, of course you do. I can't tell you anything. I'm so clumsy." "Love is in my eyes, but he loves me." "In the meantime, Alvin, tell me what you know." "And one more thing. I'm sorry I didn't believe you that day." "Who knows? If I'd agreed to see you, we'd both be well. No one can know that, but why don't we go to the ward or the lobby? It's getting fresh. You don't need a cold." They sat down in the lobby. Alvin began to tell everything he knew about Sebastian, about his previous jobs, about his relationships with women, and about the fact that he still had a mistress. "A friend told me, he's an investigator, he found out everything. I was horrified. I rushed to you, that is. I called you first, but it's clear that you didn't believe me. I thought I'd come and show you the photos. Although you said you'd already seen it all, but everyone can't lie, especially since the investigator was here. So it's already a fact. Now I don't know what to believe anymore. I wish none of this ever happened, including the meeting with Sebastian. Then why did I go to that high school friends' night? Tell me something else. Why did you find out about Sebastian? Did you have something against him? Or did you find out something bad before?" "Before? Before I knew you, Susan, I fell in love with you. Don't you get it?" Alvin finally decided to speak up. "Yes, at first sight and forever. Now I'm cursing myself for not admitting it sooner. I mean, I should have quit my job first, and then I should have confessed, wooed, pursued, and then maybe there wouldn't have been a Sebastian." Alvin? Susan, who had suspected something like that before, but thought it was just a normal youthful interest in a mature woman, was astonished. "But what are you talking about? I'm much older than you. It's just indecent." "What's indecent? Love? No, whatever you want, but you're the only one for me for all time." "What's age got to do with it? Men get old sooner, and now we look the same age. Ask anyone. So right now you, Susan, look half my age. A fragile, confused little girl next to an old man on crutches. But even so, I'll always protect and support you." "Oh, Alvin, you have no idea how grateful I am for such words, and for everything you've done for me, but I assure you, your infatuation will soon pass. All young guys fall in love with older women, a lot of them. And it's important for women not to imagine things because it's so painful to be disappointed. I've been in love for almost 3 years. Is that not an argument? You married someone your own age and what? Didn't you get any disappointments?" Alvin shouted, but then he realized it. "I'm sorry, Susan. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. I mean to remind you of something you'd rather forget. I'm not offended, Alvin. The truth is not offended, but let's forget your confession. It's not worth it. I'll never forget it. No, I'm not gonna run, jump, after you on my 3 legs. I realize you're not in the mood for that right now, but you should know that I'm always here to help you with whatever you need. I'm glad I could admit it. I'm sorry, Alvin, that I can't do anything to answer your confession, Susan said tiredly. I'll call the investigator tomorrow morning, tell him about you, give him your phone number. You have no idea how grateful I am for everything, and for your confession too. Now let's go to our rooms, or the nurses will lose us. I'll probably be discharged in a few days, but we'll see each other again, won't we? I hope so. I realize we don't have time for all that right now, but I don't think you'll be able to stop me limping someday. Maybe walking with a cane will make me look respectable. Alvin smiled. Susan returned his smile, though she looked a wreck herself. That night, she hadn't slept well, all the while remembering Alvin's words, his confused, sometimes belittling look. After what had happened, would I ever believe anyone? Even this boy who seemed so sincere? He's done so much for me. But even if he's not cheating now, the time will come and... No, I can't take another loss, she thought. The next day, Susan was discharged. She went to say goodbye to Alvin, said she had given the investigator his words and phone number, and there was no further conversation between them. I'm in a hurry now, Alvin. I have a lot of things to fix in my life and at work. But we know each other's coordinates. I hope we'll meet again and talk. I really hope so, answered Alvin. He took her hand, but did not shake it, but kissed it gently. Susan, unexpectedly for herself, bent down and kissed the young man on the head, then straightened up and walked away without looking back. She really had a lot to do. She called the office and asked them to send a car to pick her up. When she got home, she cleaned herself up in an hour, trying to wash away the hospital odors and all the worries of the last few days. Now she had to be businesslike, decisive, and strong. Walking through the apartment, Susan saw that Sebastian had already moved most of his things out. Well, that's good. Less worries, less memories. And hopefully he wouldn't come back. We should change the locks, she was thinking. And the rest of the stuff in the garbage bag and put it in the dumpster. But that could be done later. But for now she had to go to work, find out what was going on. Sebastian was making some kind of super favorable deal. We'd have to see how it turned out. She got there just in time, that is. She had already missed a lot of things. During the year of her almost reign in the firm, Sebastian had managed to slowly transfer quite substantial sums to his account. But all the claims were signed by you. What could I do? The accountant said dejectedly, I tried to inform you, but somehow you didn't pay attention. Yes, of course. No one blames you, Susan replied. She also looked at the plans for the new deal, which seemed intended to be a surprise for the wedding anniversary. Fortunately, the surprise didn't work out. With new sober eyes, Susan saw that the deal was not only unprofitable, it would be ruinous. Sebastian decided to transfer almost all the money to the account of a front company, apparently registered in the name of his mistress. Susan was in time. She managed to revoke the power of attorney and prevent this transaction from taking place. But what Sebastian had stolen, well, what can you do? There's no way to get the money back. But he'll have to answer for what he's done, and his mistress probably will too. It's unlikely he got the poison himself and poured it into her muscles. The next day, Susan went to the investigator, wrote a statement against her husband, accusing him of theft, fraud, and possible poisoning. She realized it would be difficult to prove anything, but her husband's past should have motivated law enforcement to track him down and try to prevent at least future crimes. This time the police, who had long tried to tie this man to any real crime, were quick to act. Sebastian and his mistress were detained at the airport. They already thought that the deed was done. Only happiness awaited them further, and the detention was a very unpleasant surprise. After all, they were already ready to celebrate their victory, anticipating a rich and happy life abroad. Yes, that Susan was still alive was a setback. Oh, Sebastian, I told you we should have kept her in the restaurant as long as possible and talked her into a drink, but I'm worried. Who knew that old fool would get knocked up? She's almost 40. A decent woman should be babysitting grandchildren at that age. Anyway, I called the hospital. They said she's in serious condition. I don't think she has time for that now. Well, everything's fine, and we'll be happy and free soon. The main thing is to get the principal into my account on time. Just during this conversation, the police approached the couple and asked them to follow them. How Sebastian did not rage, shouting that the boarding of their plane had already been announced. How his mistress did not beg him to let her go at least, as she has nothing to do with this man. Both were detained and taken to the detention center. Sebastian, outraged by the betrayal of his mistress, was not going to vindicate her. "What a bastard you are, Lara!" he shouted. "You have no relation, then? That's the man I've become. You want to blame it on me? Well, don't. What did you get my money for?" "What money? What else are you thinking? You planned the whole thing. You turned it around, and now it's my fault. No way. You can't put me away for nothing." The bickering continued at the confrontations, tiring the investigators to no end. However, thanks to these mutual accusations, a lot of information on the merits of the case became known. The role of Lara in the affairs of Sebastian, the degree of guilt in the poisoning of Susan became clear. "Did you really mean to kill your wife?" asked the investigator, who had seen a lot of things in his life. "Aha! I lived with her for a year and I wanted to. If I'd wanted to, she'd have been dead in a week. I wasn't even going to get a divorce. I could still use her. It was that snake. How did I know what she gave me in the bottle? She said Susan would just pass out and forget things, make it easier for her to manage. Don't listen to him anymore." Lara sobbed. He begged me to give him something to make that fool go away. "I told you not to pour out too much, half the visor only. And then she'd just get a little sick, and he'd transfer all the money to himself while his wife was in the hospital and go far away. He was the one who decided to pour it all out, especially since she was already pregnant. Susan really wanted to meet her husband, and the opportunity came, also in the investigator's office. The woman looked bitterly at the man she had loved so much in her youth and recently. After all, she thought that she would live with this man all her life, that they would be happy. "Tell me only one thing, Sebastian. How could you?" she asked, no longer hoping for an intelligible answer. "I could what?" "You couldn't. That's why I'm sitting here now." The man grinned. "That's not what I mean. You killed your child." "What baby? Did I ask you for one? Have you thought about whether I need a child?" "What do you mean you asked for it? Marriage is about having children." "No, but I still thought you were smarter than that." "What marriage? What kids? Now you think we had a bourgeois marriage. We had a union of interests. You got your share of happiness at your age, and I got my share of money. And if you hadn't been such an impenetrable fool, we would have parted too, to our mutual satisfaction. You should be grateful to me now that I got rid of that baby. An elderly single mother, wouldn't you agree, is not the best character." Sebastian looked at her defiantly and mockingly. "You were after me on purpose, weren't you? What if I hadn't come to the class reunion then? You've got a lot on your mind, sweetheart. I didn't even know about you. Well, you came along, so what's to miss? If it wasn't you, it would have been someone else. How many of you fools, who in the pursuit of money at 40 years old remembered that it would be nice to get married. You want love, and I'm a kind man. Give you love, but you have to pay for everything so that I could provide everything for the one I really loved. You could work. You had an education, right? So I worked as hard as I could. For you, working means working hard, letting life pass you by. But some people have other interests. So you dragged your sweetheart into it. You'll both go to jail now. Isn't that what you call life passing you by? Susan still couldn't understand what he was looking for. Well, we'll sit. We'll do time, but we'll get out. They won't give us a life sentence. Don't worry about us, honey. Worry about yourself now. You'll spend the rest of your life alone. Susan was not going to appeal to his conscience. There was no point in appealing to such people. Well, you're not afraid of the court. You're not afraid of prison. But there's another court, God's court, and there's a harsher sentence waiting for you. But this apparently did not frighten Sebastian at all. At these words, he simply laughed in the face of the woman who loved him so sincerely. She learned more about his pranks during the investigation. Yes, she is not the first victim of her lover. Such numbers he has done before. In recent years, he really paired with Lara, his accomplice, whose education and place of work allowed to neutralize in time, trusted women, slipping them various drugs. He could not achieve a stable income through work because he had failed in his profession. He studied with difficulty, and at the first place of work he showed himself so that he got into the unofficial blacklist. The first serious check, it could easily reveal. But Susan herself brought him to her company, so the personnel department accepted him without any checks. A friend of the missus. What are you talking about? As a result, Sebastian, for 2 years of work, managed to conclude several fake contracts, very even decent to heat his hands. And only Susan, blinded by love, did not see it, almost paid for it with her life and lost, perhaps, the only opportunity to become a mother. Now she remembered all the little bells that could have prevented the final tragedy. Not even bells, but bells rattling. Still she remained deaf, blind. Poor Alvin. He had warned her, and she had told Sebastian everything. Wasn't that why the boy was still in the hospital? Maybe that accident wasn't an accident either. Alvin was in the hospital. Susan visited regularly. He was recovering quickly from his injury, although the doctors warned that the limp might be permanent. He and Alvin had become real friends, though the young man clearly wanted a more important place in her life. But Susan still felt only gratitude to him, both for trying to ward off trouble and for helping the investigation because of his feelings, which seemed to resonate in her soul. She herself felt younger, lighter, being near Alvin. Sometimes it seemed to her that it was because of his love that she managed to be young and attractive, though she couldn't forget about the age difference. Yes, it happens that a woman of years falls in love with young people, even marries, but it's afterward, for while they are still happy as never before. Anyone can fall out of love and old and ugly. But why not let yourself be happy for as long as you can? I was happy with Sebastian too, even though it didn't last long, even though it ended so horribly, so disgustingly. But it won't be like that with Alvin. He's already proved his integrity. However, I have every reason to shun all men from now on. Then I should get a cat, sterilize it, and live together without fear that it would run away and live to a ripe old age all alone. And if I did decide to do something, I still have time to give birth to a child. Yes, I will be an elderly loner, but still a mother, not a hollow flower. So she thought, returning after another meeting with Alvin to her lonely apartment, from which, along with Sebastian's things, seemed to have disappeared and the memory of him. Alvin would sometimes start talking about his love again when they met, but Susan would stop him. If he did not try to start this conversation again, she became a little sad. I guess my Alvin got cold feet. Oh well, that's good. It's good for him and me. But the next time, it just kept happening. And Susan stopped again. Come on, Alvin. You'll meet a nice girl soon. You'll love her. Already met and loved. The young man replied firmly. Even before the trial, Susan filed for divorce to finally cut the scoundrel out of her life. She told Alvin about it when she came to meet him from the hospital. The boy was still walking with a cane, though otherwise fully recovered. They were both to attend the trial, both as witnesses and victims. The trial was a very serious one, involving some previous cases that had remained unsolved, and it soon became clear that Sebastian and his fake girlfriend would not only get away with it, but would receive the maximum punishment. Do you have any regrets about the way things turned out? I mean, about Sebastian. Susan asked Alvin as he walked out of the courthouse after a hearing. I feel sorry for myself for being such an uncommonly stupid person. Believing what? To whom? Not only did I get hurt, lose my baby, but I embarrassed myself. And why feel sorry for him? He knew what he was doing. There's no shame in falling in love. I love you and I'll always love you, even if you send me away for good. I'm not going to send you away. On the contrary, I want you back. My firm is without a lawyer, and he has enough work. Will you come? Susan smiled. You bet. If you asked me to be a janitor, to clean your entrance, I'd love to go. It would be a reason to see each other every day. And give me bouquets and coffee? Don't say no. I know whose job it was. Especially since you got fired, no one's done that. I'll give them to you every day if you let me. No, that's not necessary. We're not going to make people laugh. Susan smiled. So they started working together again. Well, everything is back to normal. Alvin thought. The only difference is that I confessed my love, but I got something like, my nose isn't big enough. But how do I convince her I'm serious? How do I get her to trust me? To love me? Alvin thought lost in thought. They often talked to each other, both at work and afterwards, sometimes going to cafes together after the end of the work day. Soon the trial of Sebastian and Lara took place. It was 6 months after the incident. Arrogance, bravado, sarcasm, all flew off this couple, only to find out that the jokes are over in terms, and they are waiting for real and not insignificant. And so, in fact, it turned out. After the verdict, Alvin and Susan went to a restaurant to celebrate the end of a long, all-studied case. I don't know, Alvin, maybe it's a sin to be happy about it, but I can't help it. I'm not so much rejoicing as celebrating the release from the nightmare, from the lies I've been living for the last year. And I really, really hope that nothing like this will never happen again in my life. I don't even want happiness. I just want release from the nightmare. I'm so tired, if you only knew. And so grateful to you for being there for me. I'm sorry I didn't believe you right away. I didn't pay attention to what you said. It would have been funny if you believed me right off the bat. Besides, I could be wrong, but I'm still the party that wants you to be okay and not have him around. And I believe you'll be very happy. I want to make you happy. No, seriously. Susan, is there any hope for me? Do I? Can I hope that for at least 5 years your feelings won't change? No, wait, don't say anything. 5 years is nothing, but they'll flow differently for us. You'll mature into a serious, solid man, and I'll be 5 years older. Oh, you again? I told you, it doesn't matter. Alvin was very tense as he decided to finally clear the air about the relationship. If Susan and this time will answer with a refusal, citing the age difference, he did not know what to do. Just get out of her life, not to annoy with his confessions and himself, and not to torment in vain hopes. Yes, that would probably be the best course of events. How many rejections do you get? They do. Susan crumpled her napkin nervously. Marry me? Alvin took the ring box out of his pocket and placed it on the table in front of her. I can't live with this uncertainty anymore. Either say yes or say no definitively, and I won't bring it up again. The woman, with slightly trembling fingers, took the box, opened it, and admired the ring with the red stone. Yes, Alvin, yes. I'll save the peace and freedom for later. Okay? Let's say we live another 5 years. For the sake of 5 years of happiness, I can risk 5 years with a man who I can see loves me and whom I also love. Alvin walked around the table, approached Susan, kissed her on the lips for the first time. The company at the next table broke into applause. Other visitors joined them. Congratulations and wishes of happiness flowed, and a few months later Susan and Alvin celebrated their wedding, attended by all their colleagues who also sincerely wished happiness to the young people. They did look very happy indeed, and were so. No age difference was noticeable, and Susan herself did not think about how old she was. It was the first year of her real life, and that year ended with an even happier event. Susan had given birth to a son, a healthy, beautiful boy. All the failures and misfortunes of the past could be forgotten, as could the age difference between the parents. Susan was at last completely happy and no longer thought of her years. She had more to think about than just some numbers.
Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Miranda was agitated and excited. She had been busy in the kitchen since morning. In the middle of the day, her refrigerator was no longer able to hold the numerous appetizers and salads. On the stove, there was a huge pot of roast from the oven. Came intoxicating aromas of such a pie with berry filling. The woman was still circling between the table and the cupboard, figuring out what else she could create from the food at her disposal. Despite the abundance of dishes, Miranda felt that she had prepared too little food and the guests would go hungry. And the guests were expected to be important. A few days ago, Miranda and Sebastian Jenkins' daughter accepted a marriage proposal from her fiancé David for the city. And today, Jenkins was scheduled to meet David's out-of-town parents, and Miranda was terribly afraid of making a mess of things in front of her new in-laws. She looked thoughtfully into the refrigerator, wondering if she should add some raw slices to the existing slices. When Sebastian's husband entered the kitchen, assessing the situation, he walked over to his wife, put his arm around her, and gently pushed her away from the stock of provisions. "Miranda, calm down," he said affectionately. "You've already cooked enough to feed a company of soldiers. The guests won't eat it. They won't even be able to taste it." Do you think the woman was hesitant to go to the refrigerator? "I keep thinking there's something missing. Everything is enough, and even with a surplus," reassured her husband. "You'll see for yourself. Then we'll finish it for 2 more days, as if you're not happy about it." On the business of Miranda's husband, he laughed. "Glad, of course. A kitchen full of goodies. Of course I'm glad. I see you're sweet and sour, and the meat's confused. Why are you trying so hard?" "Me and Kevin are nervous," my wife confessed frankly. "What if we don't like each other? What if something goes wrong? The first impression is the strongest. David's parents won't like some little thing. That's it. And we have to communicate with them later about the wedding, and in general with relatives to be friends. And there's a big age difference between us. Maybe we won't hit it off." Sebastian and Miranda married late after 30, and their daughter was born even closer to 40 years old. Now the daughter was 22 years old, and the parents were approaching 60 years. In the family of the future son-in-law, everything was exactly the opposite. For city elders played a wedding almost immediately after school, and a year later gave birth to a son. They weren't even 40 yet, and their future daughter-in-law's parents could act as their parents at the same time. Miranda, it was very unsettling. "Don't worry prematurely," Sebastian reassured his wife. "Don't you think we don't have many young acquaintances? A lot, and we communicate with all of them somehow. At the very least, apply your professional skills to go for the city. We're fascinated by all native. Extinguishes the oven and let's go. We'll have a little rest. We'll have some tea. Worse? No. For the guests, than a tired and withdrawn hostess. They'll be here in 300 hours. That'll give you time to catch your breath and take a shower. And I'll set the table while you're here. Yeah, Lisa will help. Don't worry, we'll make it perfect." "Oh, my heart is racing," Miranda sighed. "And if something goes wrong, Lisa will be upset too." Lisa was the name of the Jenkins daughter, the bride-to-be, which is what all the fuss was about. Actually, Miranda wanted to name her daughter Lisa, and Sebastian was fine with it. But as often happens, the young mother had no time to deal with the paperwork for the baby, and this duty was entrusted to the newly minted father. But here's the trouble. On the day when Sebastian was going to visit the registry office, he was attacked by some insidious virus. In the morning, the man felt only a slight malaise. But in the middle of the day, he had a fever, ran a very bad runny nose, covered his throat. Somehow Jenkins waited until work was over. He had asked his bosses to leave early so that he could get to the registry office before closing time. Overcoming weakness, he got to the office, but because of a runny nose, he pronounced his daughter's name inaudibly. At the end of the day, the woman who was working on the birth certificate did not ask him to repeat the name, but wrote it down as she heard it. Sebastian himself was in agony and fever. Neither did he reread the documents issued to him, just took the papers and went to his parents. He reasoned that it was not worth bringing a contagion into a house where a newborn child lived. He was given a week's sick leave. A few days later, when the weakness receded, and Sebastian, taking advantage of his free time, as a decent parent, took copies of the documents to the clinic, to the milk kitchen, to the accounting department of the institute where he and Miranda worked, and to some other organizations that had to be notified of the baby's arrival. This is how Miranda found out that her daughter's name was Robert and not Lisa, only 10 days after the birth certificate was issued. And that document had already been seen by so many organizations that it would have been too much of a hassle to redo it. The woman grumbled at Sebastian, of course, for a long time. But to the name of her daughter got used to unexpectedly, quickly. Especially her mother-in-law, having learned about the mishap, said with a laugh. And that she even suits this name. Look how thin and flexible she is. Lisa is Lisa. Jenkins was indeed born skinny and thin. No counter and no tugging. There was no infant resemblance at all. But the flexibility and firmness was there from birth. And that's what my mother-in-law accurately pointed out. Miranda had to put a lot of effort into swaddling the baby. Lisa turned from diapers, described from diapers, and even using the decay of legs, somehow expressed. This is how she grew up slender, thin, flexible, and willful. But despite the girl's unruly character, her mother loved her very much and worried about her daughter. Almost as much as in her childhood. That's why she was worried now before meeting her future relatives. She wanted everything to go off without a hitch. Good, at least with David, future son-in-law Jenkins, were familiar with a long time ago. We cannot worry unnecessarily. Who did the bloodline decide to marry? David was a positive guy in every sense, and Miranda and Sebastian liked him very much. Young people met right after graduation. David and his classmates celebrated the awarding of diplomas in the same restaurant as Robert fellow students. The girl studied at the PhilFac, and David in a technical university at the Faculty of Road Maintenance. Girls and men quickly took notice of each other. They got reacquainted and soon mingled. This evening formed several strong, stable couples, and Robert and David were among them. True, With the wedding, they lasted longer than the rest of the fellow students. Robert wanted to find a good and steady job before the wedding. Since childhood, she dreamed of becoming a journalist. But in her time, she did not get enough points in the profile faculty, so she applied for the philological faculty. Starting from the second year, the girl tried herself as a freelance correspondent in different city and regional editions. But quite quickly, it became clear that the text was not cramped. She wanted to illustrate her words, at least with photos, or better, with video. That's the only way the girl thought. It is possible to penetrate the modern news consumer, to convey to him what you really want to say. Therefore, having received a diploma, the girl began to storm television. It took her 6 months to get on a local TV channel, and another 6 months to get a foothold there and become in demand. Even a relatively popular correspondent, whose stories viewers waited for, watched with attention, and discussed later both in kitchens and on social networks. All the while, David, immediately after graduation, having got a job in one of the city's construction trusts, courted the rising star of the screen and waited for her consent to the wedding. And then he did. Lisa came running home an hour before the guests arrived. She brought the drinks, helped set the table, shared the abundance and variety of treats. The out-of-towners showed up on time. And half an hour after the start of the feast, Miranda realized that she was worried for nothing. Kelly and John, David's parents, turned out to be very nice people, calm, friendly, cheerful. Kelly was a housewife. She called it still herself, and in between, taking care of the house. John was engaged in entrepreneurship, kept a small manufacturing company, but did not want to talk in detail about his work. Give at least here to rest from business. The man joked back. Make friends with the parents of the future son-in-law managed to quickly enough, and the difference in age did not prevent rapprochement. So Zagorodny Sr. quickly agreed that they will not impose their wedding format on the children. Let the celebration will be held the way the young people want. I think it's the best option, Kelly said. I remember my own wedding with horror. Mom and Dad said, since we all pay for everything, we decide who to invite and where to party. And what did we get? A room full of some strange older relatives for the ransom. In the best rustic traditions, music old Toastmaster with silly contests. I wasn't even allowed to choose a dress like I wanted in the registry office. It was some kind of cake. In white rose-colored glasses, I still cannot look at the photos. Yeah, backed up John. It was a tiring event, but it's never too late to get it right. Miranda smiled softly. Now in the registry office, you can order a simple registration. Not real, but solemn and even away. At least in nature, at the beach, at home. And have a new wedding just the way you want it. Yes, Sebastian confirmed. We did that for our 25th wedding anniversary. The couple wanted to be romantic. So we did it again. We rented a Miranda dress. They organized a tuxedo for me. And we renewed our vows at the wedding palace. And you know, I was skeptical at first, but at the end of it, I got emotional. I think even more than I did at my real wedding, he laughed. John hummed skeptically, but Kelly was fascinated by the idea, and she began to ask with curiosity and interest how to organize everything, how much the ceremony cost, what are the requirements. Slightly frightened by his wife's enthusiasm, Zagorodny tried to restrain her. Kelly, wait. While we now have a wedding of children is more important. How about we do both ceremonies on the same day? Lisa immediately suggested it. That would be so great, so romantic. And again, the concept. Intergenerational. Continuity within the family. It's like nothing anyone's ever done before. The discussion went to a new level. The women loved the idea. David, as the groom, supported the thread in everything. But the older men quickly got tired of the enthusiastic plans of the group and retired to the balcony for a smoke. Having returned from a smoke break, they began to change plates on the table and finally brought hot food from the kitchen. Only with this they managed to interrupt the conversation and direct it in a new direction. Everything is so delicious, John said delightedly. I've never had a roast like this before. Miranda, are you a cook by any chance? No, are you? Laughed the venerable Miranda. I'm an honored pensioner. Cooking is a hobby. I used to work in a completely different field. I'm a psychologist, and not just a psychologist, but a doctor of psychology, emphasized Sebastian. With a meaningful thumbs up. I've never been able to reach such heights. Sebastian and I worked at the same institute, Miranda explained. Only he stopped at the master's thesis and abandoned his doctoral thesis. But I had the patience. Wait, John interrupted the woman. What do you mean? Were there psychologists in the Soviet Union? It seemed to me that they only proliferated in the last 10 to 15 years. The Jenkins looked at each other and laughed. Even Lisa laughed heartily at her future father-in-law's delusions. You're right about something, John. From the media, I said Miranda. Active popularization of psychology in our country really started only in the early noughties. But this science itself is not the first 10 years or even 100 years old. And in the Soviet Union it certainly was. Only in those years there was more demand for social psychology. The course was to work with the team on the compatibility of its participants. There were psychologists at schools, of course, at factories, at large organizations, but their activities were aimed at strengthening the corporate spirit, as they would say nowadays. And for the most part, specialists working in psychoneurological dispensaries were engaged in solving personal problems and detecting diseases, and they were of little value. I'd worked there for a while too. I was interested in interaction with specific people. I went into this profession wanting to help people, but then I saw the attitude to such help and went into science. How did you find out about the profession in the first place if it wasn't on the radar? Kelly asked. Why did it suddenly occur to you to become a psychologist? After all, you can help people in many places. Oh, that's a very interesting story. David suddenly cut in. It's not even a story of career guidance, it's a family story. Tell it, Miranda. Well, the short story was Jenkins, but her future son-in-law interrupted her. No, don't. Just tell it short, like they told me. So you already know it all by heart. Sebastian mocked the young man. So what? David objected. I like the way Miranda tells it. And the story is interesting. And Mom and Dad will understand everything about you. But now we're intrigued. John said insistently. Miranda, after such publicity you can't help telling. In fact, John did not want the conversation to return to the discussion of the wedding and the decorative registration of his wife. For the sake of it, he was willing to listen even to a family tale, though he didn't really like such stories. But he liked the wedding ceremony even less, and he didn't want to participate in such a reenactment. John expected that the story would distract his wife from the idea given at the beginning of the evening, and then she would forget about it. So he enthusiastically began to persuade his future relative to tell the story. However, Miranda especially did not resist. After a roast with tea and cake, she began her story. Miranda Kendall. In the future, Jenkins was born in a small village Pudilova 200 kilometers from the regional center. She was the youngest child in the family. Her parents had 2 older sons and a daughter. And like all younger children, Miranda grew up spoiled and loved. Although there was nothing to spoil the girl, they lived modestly. Christopher, Miranda's father, worked on the collective farm as a tractor driver. Mother Cindy Larkins worked there as a milkmaid. Simple, quiet, hard-working people. They received an average wage, kept a large farm. And Badja was chewed up at home. However, a simple countryman could be called only Christopher. With Cindy in it, all was a little more interesting. Christopher was a man of the countryside. Miranda's mother had been born on the road and had lived her entire childhood there with her parents and numerous siblings. Miranda Larkin's grandfather was chairman of the Pudilov Collective Farm. Grandmother Clara worked there as a bookkeeper. Daughter Cindy was born to them just after the war. After about a year, grandfather and grandmother tried to give education to all their children. They encouraged them to read books and be interested in various sciences. Good studies at school. This approach paid off. Cindy's two older sisters had already graduated from universities in the city and were slowly making their way into the world. The older brothers were excellent in school. They were predicted a bright future, and Cindy herself studied diligently and was regularly praised by teachers. The girl planned to become a doctor, but fate ordered otherwise. When Cindy was 10 years old, her parents were arrested. Her father was accused of embezzlement and misappropriation of collective farm property. Mother was taken with him for company. Reasoned that the chairman of the collective farm could steal state property with the complicity of the bookkeeper. In fact, there was no embezzlement. There were only inconvenient nationality of the father and an anonymous letter that came on him to the district administration. And then the punitive machine spun very quickly. One evening, 3 children of school children, Cindy and her 2 brothers, were left without parents. Where were the adults taken away? Where to look for them? How long will they serve their sentence? Neither the younger children nor their older sisters, who had traveled from the city to arrange custody, were able to find out. Much later, the older sister told Cindy that the alleged embezzlement was just a pretext for arrest. And at the trial, the prosecutors went all out, portraying the parents as enemies of Soviet power, Zionists, terrorists, and God knows who else, simply because of their nationality. As a child, from the conversations of her elders, Cindy realized that everything was the fault of her parents' positions. Everything is the fault of her parents' positions in a small collective farm. The chairman of the accountant is practically the upper class, the elite. There is always someone who is jealous and wants to live in the light. So, to live a quiet life, you have to keep your head down. So reasoned the 10-year-old girl, especially if you come from a Jewish family. And if your parents were arrested and taken to the camps, it's better to live modestly, but quietly and peacefully, than to make your way into the world, risking your life. No, Cindy didn't drop out. She graduated from high school with honors, and even turned from Cindy to Cindy Larkins. But she did not stop reading books and interested in science and medicine, in particular, subscribing to various general education magazines, watching educational programs on television when it appeared in the house. She was a woman, intelligent, erudite, finely sensitive with excellent artistic taste, but having finished 10 years of school, did not go to the city to enter the institute, and got a job in her native collective farm on the simplest and most inconspicuous job. So she spent her whole life in it, refusing even to be promoted to foreman of milkmaids. It seemed to her that even such an insignificant career advancement would bring danger to her and her family. Cindy's older brothers and sisters left for cities and towns. The girl stayed in her native village. For a while she lived in her parents' house. But soon after graduation, Cindy married Christopher Kendall and moved into a hut, which was allocated to him by the collective farm. The girl for a long time rejected the advances of the visiting guy. It even came to the point that she hid from him in the backyard. But Christopher was persistent and continued to pursue Cindy persistently and methodically. In the end, Cindy summoned him for a conversation and told him about her biography, about her arrested parents. Should you ruin your life by associating with the daughter of an enemy of the people? She asked, having finished the story. So it is necessary. Angrily replied Christopher, we have a son is not responsible for the father, I forgot, and a daughter is not responsible for her father either. And knowing where these enemies of the people come from, a month later they got married. And a few years later, the young built their own house and moved there with their first child. And the house of their beloved parents was empty and decrepit by the time of the birth of their youngest daughter, Miranda. From it remained almost one hulk towering among the weeds and frightening the children, the failing windows. Cindy sometimes took her daughter there. The two of them would walk around the property, jumping on the floor balcony inside the ruins. And Cindy Larkins would tell how things used to be here, and Miranda would listen and memorize. The girl got into the habit of visiting the old house once a week, of spending some time in it talking about the weathered walls, about her life. It seemed to her that her grandparents were invisibly present among these ruins, listening to her and delighted granddaughters' stories. Miranda decided to visit the abandoned house twice a week and strictly adhered to the schedule. Only in winter did she sometimes miss visits in the worst of the frost. The year the girl turned 10, the winter was warm and snowy. One January day, the girl sat in the ruins until almost dusk, telling at home how she and her relatives celebrated the new year. She caught up only when a snowstorm started outside. Miranda, she realized, had to get out, or the path to the street was barely trampled. She'd notice in no time. Heavily, shuffling her feet through the snow, the girl got out on the shriveled porch of the house and saw that a man was sitting on the Leningrad. Looking closer, she realized that the alien had been here for a long time. Small drifts of snow had managed to gather on his shoulders and top. Miranda was wary, but she realized she had nowhere to go. She would have to leave the lot anyway. She couldn't just sit around. She moved forward with determination, reasoned that if a man tried to attack her, she'd raise a ruckus. A dozen meters from the family ruins stood an apartment building across the street, another. Would anyone hear her screams? Barely past the lot, the path was already partially snowed over. The girl equaled the fence and found herself a couple steps away from the stranger. Looking closer, Miranda realized that on the remnants of the fence sat a woman, almost an old woman. She was dressed in some inconceivable rags. Her head was covered with a scarf. The old woman's face was unfamiliar, and it was puzzling. The village, though it had grown in recent years, but it was still small. All the inhabitants knew each other in one way or another, but this woman Miranda had never seen. She could have sworn it. The old woman sat motionless and paid no attention to the girl, didn't even turn her head in her direction. She did not seem to see Miranda. The girl began to look at the stranger and suddenly saw that tears were flowing down the alien's cheeks. "Grandmother, why are you crying?" loudly asked Miranda. The old woman did not answer, and it seemed she did not even hear that she was being addressed. The girl repeated the question and then began to shake the old woman by the shoulders. "You're all right. What's wrong? Why are you sitting here?" inquired she. "You're freezing. We should go home. Would you like me to walk you home?" Miranda's efforts were successful. The stranger finally snapped out of her trance and saw the girl. Hearing what she was being told, the old woman only sighed and shook her head. "There's no place for me to go, sweetheart," she said hoarsely, as if in a chicken voice. "I have no home." "But where did you come from?" Miranda wondered. "From afar, sweetheart," said the old woman, still monotonous, like a broken record. "I'll never make it back." How could it be? The girl was seriously upset. For some reason, a strange woman had caught her eye. "You can't just sit here, can you? It'll be night soon. The blizzard's coming. You're freezing to death." The old woman just nodded her head. The prospect of freezing to death didn't seem to bother her at all. "Come with me," Miranda said decisively. "Come and visit us. My parents are good, don't be afraid. And the house is big enough for you to sleep here." And then decide what to do next, she demandingly pulled the stranger by the arm. "Come on, let's go, or he'll notice the road. We'll never make it. My goodness, you've turned into a snowdrift." The girl managed to push the old woman out of the way, rising heavily from the debris of the fence. The stranger followed her. Miranda held the old woman's hand tightly, afraid that she would suddenly change her mind or simply get lost in the snow swirls. They reached the house after dark. Cindy Larkins was peering out the window and, seeing her daughter, jumped out on the porch. "Where they carry you grumpily," she grumbled. I kept my eyes peering. "It's nighttime. The storm is raging. And you are schlepped somewhere." The woman noticed the guest, which her daughter persistently pulled behind her all, and remained silent, then hesitantly spoke. "Hello, Mom. It's Grandma who's lost," Miranda explained. "I brought her to us. She says she doesn't know where her home is or where to go. Let her wait here tonight. We can't let her go out in this weather. We can't." The mother agreed and turned to the old woman and invited her to come in, please. "Here, develop here. You can hang your coat here." Cindy Larkins helped the alien to undress. Under the coat turned out to be worn another one, and under it a glass fungus sole of strange color. It seemed never to have been cleaned once in its life, when all the outer clothes were hoisted on a hanger. The old woman appeared skinny, if not skinny. The shawl from her head she was reeling, and Cindy Larkins had evidently taken to fiddling, fitting both his topcoat and Valenki. By the stove, Mama was pestering Miranda. It was Granny who said she came from far away. So she's not from our village. I don't know her. See if you recognize her. Maybe she's a local after all. They say old people sometimes forget where they live. It happens. The woman responded. She took the old woman to the corner between the stove and the table, the warmest place in the kitchen, seated her on a chair covered with a soft thread, leaned over the guest, looked into her face, and suddenly froze, scrutinizing his features. For several minutes, the two women, old and young, gazing at each other, Miranda became subdued, but looked at them both. She was surprised to hear her mother suddenly ask the old woman in a stern voice, "Laura." The alien nodded in response and, in turn, asked the landlady Cindy a question. "Cindy Larkins is now Kendall," mumbled the woman and cried. Hugging her guest tightly and resting her nose on the top of her head, the old woman picked up Cindy Larkins, but with both hands she pushed her nose into her chest and, from the sounds of it, cried too. Miranda watched the scene with all her eyes. I think she even forgot to blink. The door slammed behind her. Christopher's father entered the house. After assessing the situation, he loudly asked Cindy what was going on. Yes, Cindy, the sane woman, raised her face at her husband, flooded with tears. To Miranda's surprise, it was completely happy. "Meet Christopher," she said. "This is your mother-in-law, Clara. Sarah is my mother." Hugs she did not ponder. And the old woman, though she turned to her son-in-law, continued to hold on to her daughter with both hands. Christopher was quick to recognize the situation. "Pleased to meet you," he said politely to the guest. "So why are you standing there? Let's get the table ready. Grandma, you go, we need to feed. See, Mother is busy. Let's manage." He shook the girl by the shoulder, and only then Miranda was able to shake off her surprised stupor and began to organize in the kitchen. Slar was released from the colony 2 years ago due to the end of his sentence. None of her relatives knew about it, and there was no one to inform her of the release. During the first year of her imprisonment, Slaga strictly forbade her older children to write to her. She was afraid that such correspondence could affect their reputation in a bad way and hinder their future life. After that, she stopped replying to the letters of her daughters and sons, and later she was transferred several times from one camp to another, from place to place. And when her youngest daughter, Cindy, grew old enough to have the right to search for her mother, it was impossible to find her. Cindy sent inquiries to various authorities for several years, but it seems that the bureaucrats and the penal system themselves were confused by the paperwork and were unable to give the young woman a clear answer. I did not know my children's 3 new addresses and my own old home address. During the time in captivity, have forgotten. She only remembered the name of the village where she had once lived with her husband. That's where she decided to go. The camp authorities issued a certificate of release and some road from the colony to the village, past which the railroad passed. The woman hitched a ride. It was not far to go, about 20 kilometers away. At the station, she spent a long time finding out from the cashier how to get to the village, or rather to the center of the region in which the village was located. She and the cashier figured out the route. But here's the trouble. There were no tickets for passing trains. They said to wait. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe next week. She had nothing to do, so she decided to walk around the village near the station. The village was small, not very well maintained. There were no sights or amenities, but the woman didn't care. She was delighted by the very possibility of walking anywhere, without having to answer to anyone and without fear of breaking any rules. She wandered through the streets and alleys, looking at houses and yards, rubbing the backs of stray dogs. Sit down to rest on benches by the fences. It was September. Trees in golden foliage looked incredibly beautiful. The weather was warm and the air was fresh. Clara lost track of time, and when she found herself on the outskirts of the village, she was surprised to notice that it was beginning to get dark. The old woman moved back towards the station, hoping to spend the night at the tiny station. But at that moment, someone hit her hard on the back of the head. Clara fell to the ground and lost consciousness. She woke up in complete darkness and found herself lying in the storm. I tried to get up, but the back of my head hurt treacherously. My head was spinning. My throat was receding, nausea sticking from the fence. The woman sank back down into the thicket, examined herself under the giving grasses, arms, legs intact. Her head was not pierced. No blood, but thickets all around. The knot of Kaz is not rich yet. Not there either. I'm angry. What kind of robber went for old rags and a loaf of bread? Nearly took his life. Who do you think you're robbing? You can tell from a mile away that she's an ex-convict. They see them regularly in the village. They've learned to recognize them by now. But then Clara noticed that she wasn't wearing a trench coat and groped her body and clothes. The woman realized not only her poor belongings were stolen, the certificate of release and the little money she had were gone too. And that was a problem. She couldn't leave without her papers. The only way to legally buy a ticket from here was to show her ID. She couldn't get a passport either. And she was supposed to register with the police within a certain period of time, get a residence permit, and settle some bureaucratic formalities. If she doesn't do that, she'll go back to jail. Shit, I don't want to do that. Even the loss of money didn't bother him as much as the loss of the certificate. But what to do? Where to go? With a complaint of robbery, the woman could not understand. In fact, she couldn't even run. When she tried to stand upright, she began to feel dizzy. Consciousness threatened to leave her long-suffering head. Little by little, her eyes became accustomed to the darkness, and Clara could see a small barn nearby behind a low fence. The woman crawled toward it, climbing over the fence, which, fortunately, was no higher than her knee, climbed inside and entrenched herself in Navalny in the construction of the hayloft. I'll give it up for a while, she thought, and then I'll decide how to be, not to lie under the fence. With this thought, Revu fell asleep. She was awakened by the owner of the barn, who noticed the intrusion into his territory. He was a sturdy old man. He swore at first, but not in a mean way. What are you doing with that fence? My flower has fallen. He got angry. You could have knocked on the house, asked to spend the night like a human being. Wouldn't he have let you in? We are all human beings. We all treat your brother with understanding. However, having heard about the alarm about what had happened, the Mujikak stopped grumbling. He brought his suddenly and guests water and a crust of bread, and himself disappeared, to return soon with a policeman and a local paramedic. The police representative questioned Riva in detail about what had happened to her during the night. He examined the territory, asked for written explanations from the old woman and from the owner of the plot. The paramedic examined the old woman and diagnosed her with a concussion. At least a couple weeks of bed rest was recommended. The man, who introduced himself as Stephen, carried her into the house, arranged her on a shell bed in the kitchen, told her to rest and gain strength. Anyway, until your documents are resolved, you will not be able to go anywhere, he explained. Stephen said that Clara was not the first in their village to be attacked. For a year now, there have been some kind of seagulls in the neighborhood, hunting for ex-convicts. To recognize them among the locals was simple criminals Spodaroatel, or people who came out of the camp and poked them intimidated, and sometimes just attacked from the back and publicized, as it happened with Lika, and then robbed afterward. Why? The old woman was perplexed. What good would they do to us? There's nothing to take from us. No property, not even pennies on the road. Oh, you silly Clara, Stephen lamented. And the documents are a certificate of release. That's their main prey. And that's what they're after. And what do they do with certificates? Do they get free train tickets? I continued to wonder, do they need those tickets? Waved Stephen away. You understand that the most important thing in the certificate is that you can get a real passport with it. No check will not dig up. And with this passport, you can do so much with it, or sell it for good money. And these crooks know exactly who needs such a document. They correct the certificates in Ashen as they need them. They change the year of birth, change the photo, glue it to these papers at the passport office. They look very closely, especially if the passport office is far from the camp. So they go far away. And then they use the stolen documents to get passports. That's what our district officer told me, he explained. These bastards have been hanging around here for a long time, but they can't catch them. They're running all over the neighborhood. And with their traveling, it's all over the country. The effects of the concussion took a long time to wear off. Her weakness became her constant companion. She stayed at Stevens for over a month. During this time in the local militia, you gave the woman a new certificate, and she received a passport here in the village. You had to go to the permanent place of residence to get the documents. There was no time to go there. The legal deadline was coming to an end. Stephen persuaded the old woman to winter at his place. The man lived alone. His parents had died long ago. He had no wife and children. His brothers and sisters were partly scattered across the country and partly taken away by the war. He was glad to be alive. He was glad to have a soul in the house. He reasoned that it was worth to gain strength and recover before a long trip. Besides, the winter promised cold, and there were no warm clothes. Until the end of May, she lived in the house of her savior, kept house, cooked food. She worked part-time as a cleaner in the village Novi Club, in order to save at least a little money for the road to her native village. When summer came, she got ready to go. She felt better, noticeably stronger. She felt less dizzy. And what about the occasional memory lapse? She tried to ignore that. She said goodbye warmly to Stephen. The man had packed her a substantial bag of provisions for the journey and wanted to give her some money, but she decided that her own savings would suffice. The journey was supposed to take a couple of weeks, but somehow it took almost a year and a half. How come? Leek didn't finish listening. Fell asleep exhausted by the events of the evening. Already later she mentioned that at some point she forgot where she was going, and when she came to her senses, she found herself at an unfamiliar station with no provisions and almost no money. She traveled part of the way on foot. Sometimes she caught a hitchhiker, rode as a hare between the train cars, asked for alms, asked for lodging in villages, slept at the stations, on benches, wherever she had to. And when after all the ordeals she finally reached Putilov and saw her native house in ruins, she almost lost her mind. It became clear that the long journey had been made in vain. There were no relatives. There was nowhere to bow one's head. Of course, one could walk through the village, look for people who remembered her, stay with them. But the old woman was afraid. She still didn't know which of the villagers had written that unfortunate anonymous letter about her and Larkins. But just in case, she trusted no one else. From fatigue and confusion, the old woman fell into a kind of mental trance. In this state, she sat on the cook fence of her former home for over an hour. She would surely have frozen there if Miranda hadn't noticed her. Destiny. The adults alone spoke with significance. It's all mysterious. Others echoed them. I thought nothing was fate. There was no mysticism and mystery in her meeting with her grandmother. It's just that for so many years she'd been calling her home. With her constant stories, with her presence in her house, Grandma just couldn't help but hear. So it's all right. The Kendalls had set up Slaga in a passageway room. The rest of the rooms in the house were occupied. Daughter and son-in-law fixed up the old lady. Did the department grant her a pension? By spring, Clara recovered from her long journey and joined the life of the family. Cindy Larkins clearly thanked all the gods in the world every day for bringing her mother back. Miranda adored her grandmother, even though she was not a sugary character. The old lady was her own free-spirited, risk-taking self, but her relatives forgave her for it. Everyone realized that if she had been God's dandelion, she simply would not have survived either in the camp or after it. Cindy wrote to her sisters and brothers about her mother's return, and all summer long the Kendall family had a pilgrimage of guests, of joyful guests. Was that summer happy, filled with the brightest emotions? But with the onset of fall, a serious problem arose in the house. She began to scream in her sleep, talking loudly with interlocutors unknown to anyone. "Give me my bread, or all the assholes are pulling," she shrieked in the middle of the night. "The certificate. My certificate. Where is it? They'll put me back in camp without it. I don't want to." The scream woke up the family. The next night, everything hurts inside. The old woman read in the night, without thinking, "The eye of the bishop. Why such a punishment? It's like I'm being torn to pieces," she called at the top of her voice. "Fooled him. Where are you dragging him? You bastards." These cries woke up the whole house. At first, they were repeated about once a week, but by midwinter, Clara was getting the whole family out of bed every day. She herself remembered nothing of the bad dreams or her screams, but would only shut up when her daughter or grandchildren pulled her out of her sleep. The old woman was embarrassed by the trouble she caused her loved ones, but she couldn't help herself. Sleeping pills and sedatives that the village paramedic offered did not help. After them, on the contrary, it became more difficult to wake up the old woman during her nightmares. She should be treated in a psychoneurological dispensary, thoughtfully said the local medic Cindy. At these words exploded. "Do you want me to send my own mother to a mental institution? That's the last thing we need." But nevertheless, Kendall's life was becoming increasingly difficult. The family stopped getting enough sleep. Grandma's seizures could recur several times a night, and there was no rest in between. Christopher and Cindy became irritable. They often complained of fatigue. No wonder, because after restless nights they had to go to work. Yes, it's not easy shifting papers in a warm office. And doing physical labor. Miranda and her older brother also felt the impact of not having enough to eat, although it was a little easier for them as children than for adults. It went on like this until the spring. By May, Cindy Larkins was ready, if not to accept the paramedic's suggestion that the old woman be treated in a mental hospital, then at least to discuss it further. She and her husband were completely exhausted and didn't know what to do. Miranda, hearing the conversation of the elders, realized that the grandmother would not approve of the treatment. Moreover, she would be angry at her daughter for such a decision. And then Miranda would be angry with her. The girl suggested to her mother to move the old woman to her room. She lived in the farthest corner of the house from her parents' bedroom and hoped that from there she would not hear her scream so much. "She'll give you no peace at all," Cindy Larkins lamented. "So what?" Miranda waved it off. "It's summer. I don't have to get up for school during the day. At least you and Daddy will have a rest." Was the girl so convincing, Mother? Too exhausted. But soon the old woman's relocation took place. The first few nights the girl swore, jumping out of bed, hearing another scream. However, after a few days she thought that it was possible to try to cope with the grandmother after a nightmare sleep and forced booth. The old lady fell asleep for a long time, noise contrived, complaining about the fact that it disturbs her granddaughter. It's exhausting even more than her shouting. And Miranda decided to come up with a way to soothe her without waking her from sleep. At first, the girl simply approached her grandmother, barely hearing her voice, stroked her head, and on her hands quietly and affectionately coaxed her. "It's a dream, Grandma," she repeated patiently. "It's not real. It's all right. You are at home. No one is hurting you. Mommy and Daddy are there for you. They'll protect you." But the old woman just didn't hear her granddaughter. And then Miranda devised another plan. The next night in the next bed, there were cries. "That's my bread, give it back, to whom I say, you shameful thief." Miranda sneaked up on her grandmother and spoke persuasively. "Here's your bread, girl. Nobody's taking it away from you. I took it to salt you with salt, it tastes better. Here." The girl repeated it several times, and suddenly Clara heard her. "It tastes better with salt." She agreed. "Thank you. Forgive me, I was scared." The old woman turned sideways and fell asleep peacefully. Miranda froze enthusiastically at her bedside. Had it really worked? The rest of the night passed surprisingly quietly. In the morning, the lyricist rose awake before noon. She wanted to tell her grandmother about the night's events, but with some sixth sense she realized that it was not worth it. Instead, she asked her grandmother, "You sometimes yell about bread at night. Did someone really take it away from you?" "True," the old woman replied reluctantly. "I had just been brought to the first camp in Barak, and there was a woman who tried to take my rations. I attacked her. Where did the anger come from? I don't know." My grandmother was silent, and then she added, "But you know, I remember now that she gave me back my piece. She said she wanted to salt it." Miranda nodded her head. She didn't know how the story of the stolen harmonica really ended, but she suspected that the outcome was not as peaceful as her grandmother saw it today. She remembered the phrase about salt from a dream in which her granddaughter had intervened. The girl decided to continue her experiments, but not only to appease her grandmother, but also out of research interest. The next night, barely beyond the dream, she began to wail pitifully. "Everything hurts, like it's tearing me to pieces from the inside." Miranda immediately crept over to her bedside and spoke closer. "Get some rest. Here is the most modern medicine for you. You take it. Everything will go away. Everything will stop hurting. Good for you." As if letting go, muttered the grandmother a moment after the girl's words. "Of course," confirmed Miranda. "The pain will go away now. You sleep. You'll wake up and forget everything." Soon the old woman stopped moaning. She sang and even curled up under the blanket. Miranda realized that the nightmare had receded. Once again, the grandmother slept peacefully until morning. But the next day, her granddaughter did not ask her about the nightmare. Determined not to awaken her memories, Miranda took the experiment seriously. She kept a notebook in which she noted how often she talked to Clara in her sleep, how quickly she calmed down, whether the attack was repeated, and soon noticed from her notes that the nightmares in which she managed to wedge in repeated less and less often, and after a few months and disappeared altogether. This encouraged the young explorer even more. In her for a flicker of hope that it will be possible to completely cure her grandmother of night attacks. And soon this hope was confirmed. Nightmares began to visit her less and less often. Sometimes Miranda slept through the night without her screams. Sometimes you only had to get up to her once a night. But there was no more like the beginning of last fall, when Slaga read every 2 o'clock. Miranda considered it her small victory. Not always the girl managed to calm the old woman with the first time to pick up the words. For example, when Clara started calling for her husband and screaming to let him go, she usually had to be woken up. "Miranda, I tried telling her your husband wasn't taking him anywhere." But the old woman didn't believe it. She'd spent too many years without her husband. She remembered the separation too well. The phrase, "We'll figure it all out and bring your husband back." No one of Slava's age would have believed such a statement from the law enforcement officers. Miranda went through the phrases. I wrote down the unsuccessful ones. Finally, she guessed to address her grandmother as if on behalf of her grandfather and promise her that he would surely survive, and they would meet again. Soon after this discovery, Clara's most agonizing nightmare gradually let her go. Before the start of the school year, Cindy Larkin suggested that her daughter move her grandmother from her bedroom back into the pass-through room, but Miranda refused. She reported to her mother that Clara had become a much more restful sleeper. Cindy had noted this herself, although her daughter's room was away from the bedroom. At first, she often heard the usual night noises from there, but by the end of the summer, such episodes became fewer and fewer. After rejection, she was glad several times to the door of her room at night, hearing her mother's voice and eavesdropping on what was going on. Finding out what was going on, Cindy Larkins pondered the situation and went to hold a consultation with the local paramedic. He approved of Miranda's methodology. The doctor talked to the girl, read her diary of observations of her grandmother, asked about the results, and afterwards he praised Miranda fervently, saying that if she continued her experiment, she would be able to cure her grandmother completely. He explained for a long time how and why the method invented by Miranda works. He said some wise words the girl did not understand even half of it. But she did. She's on the right track. A year later, a peaceful sleep returned to Kendall's house. She stopped screaming at night. And if she had a nightmare, the family knew how to calm her down quickly. They didn't tell the grandmother herself. They just tried to treat her as kindly as possible. Miranda could be proud of herself, but she had no time for that. She judged the paramedic for a while to explain to her how things had turned out in simple words. To the medic's credit, he did not dismiss the curious girl and managed to lay out his assumptions for her. In addition, he recommended several popular scientific publications from which you can understand how the human psyche works. The subject fascinated Miranda, and she plunged headlong into the study of psychology, first on the basics, and then more seriously. By the end of school, the girl already knew exactly what she wanted to devote her life to and did not retreat from her decision. All this long story Miranda told the parents of her future son-in-law. Of course, it was much shorter, although David constantly intervened in the narration, clarified the details, drew the listener's attention to the details. He himself had heard this story not for the first time and liked it very much. He admired the ingenuity of little Miranda, the selflessness with which she took to help her grandmother, the patience and warmth of heart she showed during her impromptu healing session. "I would never have thought of this at 11 years old," the young man exclaimed. Among other things, David was struck by the very history of the Kendall family. Born in the mid-90s, he had not seen the Soviet Union, and about repressions, camps, persecutions on ethnic grounds. He knew the KGB and NKVD only through excerpts from old movies and history books. It was strange for the young boy to encounter people who had actually seen and experienced all this. He was especially surprised that these people were not stale old men, but quite cheerful and adequate people. His future father-in-law and mother-in-law, Kelly and John. Miranda's story impressed him too. After it, they had a long conversation about the vicissitudes of fate, about how childhood events influenced the choice of profession, about the Soviet era, about human kindness. The discussion of the wedding was not just on the second, but on the 10th plan. But the conversation turned out to be sincere and heartfelt. And by feelings, Jenkins brought the future relatives closer, despite their difference in age, education, and social status. After all, that was the purpose of the joint dinner. So at least, reasoned Miranda. Parted at 0:00 for the city elders left by cab. David stayed at the bride's apartment. They are sunny, sent the parents to bed, and themselves cleaned the table, went through the dishes, tidied up the living room and kitchen. The guy thought that he was obliged to help the future relatives, at least in this, since he was not allowed to help in the organization of the dinner, which was held for him, and therefore he did not know that, returning home, his mother said to her husband, "How do you like that? John, we're going to have a hereditary Jewess in our family, and from a family with a criminal record." I was hoping David would find a better match. "Okay," John responded to you. He didn't pick anything. He's in love with this thread and her family wholeheartedly. Do you care if she's Jewish or Turkish with a criminal record or a spotless one? They have plenty of money. Pensions for doctors of sciences, a decent apartment. You've seen for yourself what a great party they are in material terms. And you and I don't need anything else. We decided to get married in 6 months in September. I didn't want beautiful fall photos under the dress. David was not against it, and parents amicably decided not to hinder the newlyweds and not to impose their ideas about the celebration. While the bride and groom were saving money for the party, outfits, treats, and a bachelorette party, it was decided long ago that after the wedding, the young people will live at Jenkins and save money for the down payment on the mortgage. And they should have thought about their careers. Both boys had little seniority, couldn't afford to borrow much money from the bank, and the salaries were not such that painlessly pay off the loan for housing. Miranda and Sebastian were completely satisfied with this solution. They found it reasonable in their large apartment with 3 isolated rooms. There was enough space for both parents and the young family. But the out-of-towners didn't like the idea for some reason. But openly, they did not express their protests. John, in mail conversations with Sebastian, he periodically complained that the son does not act according to the rules. They said that a man should bring his wife to his house and not move to her. Jenkins on these speeches only guffawed. It's all prejudice and long out of date. John came in, on the other hand. But a young family, come to think of it, they want to make some noise sometimes. But during this very time, and there are parents behind the wall, you have to admit, it's embarrassing. Imagine yourself in such a situation and will never have grandchildren. You've been here, John. Sebastian wondered. From the thread and the room to our half of the apartment. How noisy do you have to be for us to hear, unless you yell into a microphone? Would the guests want to invite us to a party? I guess, John. People need a place to gather with their friends. Or they'll just sit up late watching TV, and you'll be noisy at 0 o'clock. We're fine, smiled Jenkins. Yeah, agreed, was John. I remember Miranda wasn't used to being kept up at night by the noise from the in-laws. Sebastian gave his companion a serious look, raised an eyebrow questioningly. I mean that she could endure the inconvenience for a long time for the sake of the people closest to her and not say anything to them about it. Tactfully, I'm a woman, John quickly mouthed and curtailed the subject. There was no need to quarrel with the future in-laws yet. Kelly was more subtle. Over a cup of tea, she could complain to Miranda. David, the other day, my boy was frying cutlets. I come in. Oh my goodness. The whole kitchen's smoky. The stove's got grease on the coffee. Splashes on the table, flowers scattered. And he sits in front of a mountain of cutlets and says I'm treating my mom. And he doesn't notice what he's turned the kitchen into. You have to be such a Bezrukov. Grown-ups are already on the torture. You're with him, Miranda. Not scared. He was joking. Kelly, you haven't seen what goes on in our kitchen. After Sebastian's fish fry. The man is incorrigible. Kelly nodded, but by the next meeting, she'd start all over again, all over me. Would you be comfortable living with Slovaks? After all, a stranger in the house, and besides, a young man just so from the morning from the bedroom in a nightgown will not jump out of the bedroom. I have never been in the habit of jumping out of the bedroom unclothed, Miranda objected softly. David is no stranger to us. He's stayed overnight, or on weekends more than once. We've never been inconvenienced. Don't worry, Kelly. No worries at all. It's one thing to have him as a guest, and quite another to have him as a permanent resident. And that you're getting tired of this topic being mooted. You guys can't have a life. You yourself understand it perfectly well. And to rent an apartment, it is not rational at their incomes that the newlyweds settled for the city could not be out of the question. Everyone understood that. The David family lived in a 2-room adjoining Khrushchevka, where the guy owned a passageway room. When he was a teenager, he tried to persuade his father to make repairs and isolate his room. But John quickly explained to his son the unreality of this idea. Expensive, messy, troublesome. The room would be cramped. The apartment will be blocked by a dark, long corridor, which is not used rationally. In addition, because of this, redevelopment will reduce the living area of their Khrushchevka, which will lead to a drop in its value. In short, unprofitable from all sides. David then reconciled, blocked off part of the room with a closet, thus allocating himself a personal space, and about the repair shut up. Later, getting acquainted with Robert, he sometimes regretted that he did not show insistence to bring the girl in a separate room. Although tiny, it still goes anywhere, but in the country behind the closet is simply impossible. The current hints of David's parents only annoyed, especially since for the city expressed their thoughts not only Jenkins Sr., but also Netta. For example, one day Kelly took the future daughter-in-law to the cat show, and their threads looked at one of the kittens, a red and fluffy Maine Coon. The girl more than half an hour stood near his cage, admiring and pleasing. "So let's buy him," Kelly suggested. "I'll add to you if you don't have enough." "You can't," sighed Lisa. "Dad's allergic to cats." "Then get the breeder's contacts and buy one after the wedding," Kelly suggested. And then, as if she'd come to her senses, she added, "Oh, you'll be living with your parents anyway. If only you had your own apartment." Slowly, Kelly and John put their future daughters-in-law into the family's heads. The idea that the young ones needed their own place. Eventually, Miranda got fed up with it. She summoned the town's spouses for a talk, and she called David and Robert and her husband. "Kelly, John," she began, "we've all noticed that you don't like the prospect of David living in our apartment after the wedding. Let's discuss this situation once and for all. First, let's admit to each other that we have no alternatives. The young people will not be able to live with you. This will inevitably lead to domestic conflicts. We are not in a position to buy an apartment. We don't have that kind of money. We do not intend to exchange our existing housing. You, as far as I understand, you also do not have the financial means to evict David. Otherwise, you would have done it a long time ago." John shook his head. "No," he admitted, "except for a down payment. We could scrape together a studio of some kind." "Not a studio," Lisa resented. "If you're going to mess with the mortgage, then buy a full-fledged apartment, albeit one room these to fly. Where is the room combined with the kitchen? Well, we'd probably add something to your money for a down payment, but we don't have a lot of money. I warn you, we'll get a one-room Khrushchevka somewhere in the suburbs. And the guys are still more comfortable living in the center. It's not far to work, and there's all the infrastructure. They can't rent an apartment and save for a mortgage at the same time. So, I believe, moving in with us, David, is the only sensible decision, especially since the children made it themselves. We expect it won't be for long." David cut in. 5 years at the most. "But that's me calculating the worst-case scenarios. Moreover," said Sebastian, "we will help by providing housing and not requiring the kids to contribute to the household expenses, so as not to slow down the rate of savings. But I would object to the expenses," said David. "I don't like to be a freeloader. And we will discuss it." "If necessary," Miranda responded immediately. "That's what the situation looks like so far. Maybe you see some other ways to solve it that the four of us don't see." She turned to Kelly with John, for the townspeople looked at each other, shrugged confusedly. "Not yet, it seemed," Kelly said. "In that case, let's consider it a done deal," Jenkins summarized. "And please don't start any more conversations about how inconvenient it is for anyone or how wrong it is in general. It's tedious and uncomfortable," Smith's words added, and almost with glee. Kelly and John had to agree before the wedding. They kept their heads down and didn't broach the subject of bridal real estate again. All the more did not remember the idea to organize on the day of their marriage. For Kelly and John, the future mother-in-law was only in favor, but he himself categorically did not want a second ceremony. Realizing that the man cannot change his mind, Lisa said, "Well, and the hell with it, come up with something more interesting." And came up with as a bachelorette party arranged all the close women, including Miranda and Kelly, masked photo shoot in wedding dresses. For this event, she invited several makeup artists and hairdressers, conspired with a rental salon to provide outfits and space, and with a nearby restaurant. About a small buffet. The ladies were a little shy at first, but the champagne abundance of outfits around did their job. Soon, everyone invited, with pleasure and excitement, tried on dresses, posed for photographers, tested unusual makeup. The party turned out very girlish and yet romantic. No, she was pleased. And Kelly later told her in confidence that even re-registration with her husband would not have given her so much joy and pleasure. In short, there was no time to discuss where the new family would live. However, John had prepared a surprise for the wedding dinner. The dinner was modest. Only the young people and their parents celebrated the marriage. With friends, David and Robert decided the next day, and immediately after the registry office and photo shoot went with their relatives to a cozy restaurant. David In the city of excellent cuisine and service of extra class, when the turn came to handing out gifts, the new father-in-law solemnly rose from his seat and said, "Guys, I decided as a gift to buy you an apartment. Here are the documents." He held out to the newlyweds a thin folder. "I thought," he continued, "that my savings are enough either for a ready-made studio or a two-bedroom. But for the construction phase, I mean the down payment. Of course, I wouldn't be able to afford the whole thing. But so far my earnings are stable, and one good contract should be coming up soon. So I got in touch with a real estate developer. And now we have a two-room apartment near the center. True, the house is still at the foundation stage, but the builder is reliable. I checked. It's scheduled for completion in 2 years. They're giving it to you with renovation. Just move in and live. Once it's built, now we'll register the house with you. In the meantime, the loan is on me, and I'll pay. It's a gift after all." The news made a lot of noise around the table. Robert and her husband and parents went to see the house under construction a couple of days later. The new building was indeed very well located in the so-called quiet center. The neighborhood was green and cozy. Not far from the house were stores of basic necessities. Kindergarten school. There was a prospective apartment in the next block. Sebastian grinned, and with grandchildren will be comfortable to live. And the manager who accompanied them would also confirm. "We have in the project provides wheelchairs on the first floor ramps at each porch and a great playground in a closed courtyard. And the whole territory is under video surveillance. You can even let one child go for a walk and not worry about his safety." Jenkins' senior impression, and nodded approvingly. She didn't let this information pass her ears. She looked at the floor plans with curiosity, looked for her future apartment on the floor plan. And when she found it, it seems that she immediately began to arrange the furniture there in her imagination. A representative of the developer took the families to a neighboring building, recently commissioned by his company. Some of the apartments in it were still empty, and it was possible to get inside and look at the renovation by the builders, and generally assess the quality of housing. After this trip, even David, who had previously been skeptical about his father's gift, felt grateful to John and began to dream of moving. "Great," Sebastian exclaimed on the way home. "Here he was being a friend to you, and here's a royal gift for you guys. But for now, he's not splurging too much." "It's cool," Miranda noticed. "At the foundation stage, these apartments are cheap enough. Not a penny, of course. But for our 3-bedroom, we can get 3 two-bedrooms like this. He'll splurge later when he starts paying off the loan." I suggested to my father that we pay off the loan. David responded immediately, but he refused. He said it was his gift. It was the best we could do. "What is this? Us taking over the mortgage after we move in? When the apartment's built, when it's finished, my dad'll transfer it to us. We'll live and pay for it then. Until then, he's on his own." "Is it a big payment?" asked Sebastian, and hearing the amount, whistled delightedly. "Almost my entire pension," shocked the matchmaker. "He says that as long as his income allows," David explained. "Yes, he is also counting on some contract with Europe, which will supposedly provide him and my mom with income for eternity. I don't know much about his business affairs," finished the young man, a little embarrassed. "You don't need it. You have your own work to do," Miranda reassured her son-in-law. "But God willing, it will all work out. Basically, nothing has changed yet," Lisa said thoughtfully. "We are still living with you and still saving money. Only now it's not for the mortgage, but for renovation and furniture. Let's see how this developer shows himself. Although it will be a pity, of course, if something is delayed." That was that. David settled down in Robert's room, moved his things and computer, and set up his own workspace. He really got along with his wife's parents without any problems. Of course, there were some little things in terms of everyday life, which had to get used to anew. But it was perceived and mighty with his father-in-law as an inevitable stage of lapping, and did not cause violent emotions. In general, the two families coexisted in one apartment quite peacefully. On weekdays, they did not see each other very often. The young ones worked late, and after work they usually went to some events like concerts in bars, theater performances, or just visiting friends. The older generation had their own thing going on. Sebastian continued to work part-time at his institute, and on weekends he went fishing, including in winter. Julia counseled privately and worked with students, helping them write academic papers and conducting research. Officially, the Jenkins seniors were retired, but they could not imagine life without work. Once a month, the families would stop by the construction site and were pleased to see that the house where their apartment would be located was coming up. The construction was strictly on schedule, and in some aspects even ahead of schedule. And David and Robert gradually got used to the idea that they would live here. Little by little, they got acquainted with the neighborhood, planned the situation in the future housing. Even Robert's parents had already accepted the idea and were discussing their children's plans with no less enthusiasm than they were. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. Moreover, John made regular installments on the loan to the builder. Thus passed about half a year. Towards spring, the Jenkins noticed that John had become nervous and anxious. Sebastian called him for a conversation and learned that the conclusion of the contract with European partners, on which the man had pinned so much hope, for some reason stalled. "We'll have to tighten our belts, it seems," sighed the matchmaker. "With the current customer, we have a contract ends in May. Will he renew it or not? We don't know yet, and it's not a very convenient customer. In general, he will get discounts from us when renewing. How's that sound? And where will I get them from? We're already working with him at almost cost price. I also bought some equipment specifically for the Europeans. The money is spent, and the equipment is idle." They didn't know what John Jenkins was doing. Even David couldn't explain to them the specifics of his father's company, some kind of small production. But what kind of manufacturing? What does it produce and who does it sell to? No one knew. John himself, starting to talk about the work, began to rush with obscure terms, from which the interlocutors quickly tired. So his explanations did not add clarity. But Sebastian understood the wholly financial crisis. "John, with the mortgage you pull so far or help?" he asked. "Pulled until God willing," the man responded. However, a couple months later, John came to Jenkins and said to Sebastian, "Listen, Saint, help. I can't take any more credit. I scraped together the last pennies for the last payment, and I don't know where to get money for the next one. I work alone. You know, Kelly, we're all looking out for ourselves. She's no help at all." "What are you talking about, John?" Sebastian exclaimed. "I'll help, of course. We're not strangers. And the apartment is being built not only for your son, but also for my daughter. Tell me where to transfer and by what date. I'll do it." "Thanks, my brother-in-law helped me out. By next month I'll have it up and running," John promised. "Oh, and don't tell the kids, please. It's embarrassing. He said it was a small gift for the wedding, and now he's left with nothing." "I won't tell," Sebastian reassured his relative. "I'm not going to tell you, I guess. I have a stash that my wife doesn't know about, just for such occasions, so don't worry. We'll save your reputation." John thanked Jenkins profusely. He promised it was just a one-time thing. By the next installment, everything would be fine. But it turned out that Sebastian paid for the apartment under construction for the next year. John returned his money to him only twice, and then, not completely discouraged, and with the crisis in his company, David and Robert said nothing. The guys continued to travel regularly to the construction site and plan the move. The building where their future apartment was located was already erected, and they were excitedly measuring the floor among the still bare concrete walls and deciding where to put the sofa, where to place the table, and in which corner a floor lamp would look better. Jenkins didn't want to deprive them of this joy, but Miranda had to confess her collusion with the saint. There is no wife who doesn't know about her spouse's stash, even if it's kept in a bank account, and managed solely from a private office. Miranda noticed that her husband began to look more often than usual into the internet bank, which he had not used before, that by a certain day of the month he began to check the status of his cards, to transfer something somewhere. She didn't bother with suspicions. She just asked directly. Sebastian, who was not used to having secrets from his wife, gave in at once. Jenkins listened to the story, thought a little, and said thoughtfully, "God forbid that everything should be all right," and ended with an incomprehensible phrase for her husband: "Good that you transfer the money from your account, not cash." However, Sebastian did not pay attention to this remark. A few more months passed before John showed up at Jenkins with a penitent look. He arrived on a weekend when the entire population of the apartment and the younger and older ones were home. Gathering everyone in the kitchen, he began to get upset. Came to apologize, comrades. The contract I had so hoped for is obviously no more. With old clients, my contracts are over. All in all, my firm is almost bankrupt. I've decided to sell it for a blood loss. I'm sorry, guys, I know I promised you, but I'm not holding out. How do you mean sell it? David was surprised. What do you mean? Directly. John said sadly, I'll put it up for sale under an assignment agreement, so sell it to us. Lisa found it right away. We will continue to pay off the loan. And what will I use to pay off my work debts? John sighed. I can't charge you for the apartment. I'll take it from an outside buyer, especially since I already have one in mind. But I'm sorry, guys, I know you were hoping. But I promise you, as soon as things get better, I'll buy you a better apartment than this one. Robert and David and Sebastian. There was a lot of noise for a while, suggesting options. Miranda was silent, scrutinizing the matchmaker. Sebastian came out to escort John to the entrance and asked in a low voice, Hey, matchmaker, and my money, which I gave for the loan, will you give back from the sale? We'll decide, said the city quickly. I'm in a hurry. I'm running. A longing settled in the Jenkins apartment. The young people were upset and discouraged. They were too used to thinking of this new building as their own. They had too many plans for it. Sebastian was worried about the money he'd spent for nothing. John, after apologizing, hadn't visited in over a month, and he was unavailable by phone. Kelly made long conversations, but did not report on her husband's affairs, claiming that she knew nothing about them. One evening, after making sure the children were firmly entrenched in their room, Miranda called her husband into the kitchen and handed him some printouts. What are these? Sebastian asked, puzzled. It's data from the Roserister website, she explained. John, our faraway sold. Even before he repented to us, he came the day before. He didn't mention the debts. He didn't say anything to you. When I asked him, he said we'll figure it out. That's all. Sebastian studied the documents, then shook his head in confusion. He's a fraud, our matchmaker, sadly, Miranda summarized. Why did you jump right in? Sebastian. The man's in a financial crisis. What's in it for him? He embarrassed himself. He embarrassed himself in front of his kids. He doesn't give a damn about his kids or ours. Miranda was angry. And Sebastian's benefit is very simple and transparent. He bought this apartment at the foundation stage 1.5 years ago. Since then, and the dollar rate has grown, and the situation on the real estate market has changed, and the apartment has gone up. I saw it myself. The house is almost ready. Now this 2-bedroom is $6 million more expensive than when he bought it. I checked. Look at this. John took out a loan with no down payment. There was a developer's promotion, and he only made 5 6-month payments. So he didn't spend more than $200,000. And now he sold the apartment, paid off the rest of the loan, and got about $4 million. That's a nice profit. In 1.5 years with that kind of investment, it's a good profit, Sebastian agreed. But what makes you think it's fraud? That he thought it all out in advance and acted, as they say, in self-interest. Yes, if only because he hasn't paid you back yet. Even though he has the money from the sale, Miranda replied reasonably. It's been a month, by the way, and he hasn't even shown his face to us. Everyone hides during that time. Apparently, he's not going to give anything back. What was the point of the whole show to promise the kids an apartment? He could have just bought it for himself, waited for it to go up in value and sold it. Sebastian, but you're like a little kid, really. The woman didn't know whether to be angry or upset. Without the show, he'd have to pay the mortgage himself. So most of his mortgage was paid for. You figure you're paying for your daughter's house. Sebastian didn't have time to answer. The door opened and David came into the kitchen. David, I'm sorry, he said, slightly embarrassed, but more wary. I overheard part of your conversation. Sebastian, is that right? You paid the mortgage instead of your father. Jenkins nodded. And he didn't pay you back? The boy kept asking. Sebastian shook his head. David lowered his eyes. He was quiet for a moment. We have some savings, he said. Finally, how much does your father owe you? I can pay you back that money. There are savings and well, grumbled Sebastian. Let it sit. It'll come in handy. A son can't answer for his father, can he? The man winked mockingly at his son-in-law. And I'll pay for my mistakes myself. Maybe I'll still be able to persuade John. Let me talk to him myself, David suggested. It's easier for me. I don't think he's hiding from me. Talk if you want to, Miranda nodded. I don't think so. Are you really going to convince him of anything? That money wasn't good for us, Sebastian explained. I mean, it wasn't the last money we gave him. No offense, it was just a rainy day fund. You know, age. You gotta be prepared for all sorts of illnesses and stuff. But it's a shame. David, you know. I understand, nodded the guy. I'm offended and ashamed too. I thought you were going to call me out of the house after all this, and Robert. I'll talk to my dad. He finished and stalked out of the kitchen. John really wasn't hiding from his son, but he laughed at his requests to return the money he paid Jenkins. What money are you talking about? He was surprised. I didn't borrow from him. I didn't give him any receipts. I didn't promise to pay him back. He offered to help me when he found out about my difficulties. So I took him up on it. So he thought he was paying the rent for me and the thread. The boy objected. But what did he think? Stretched John mockingly. Yes, I promised you that apartment. But I overdid it. I didn't calculate my possibilities. But it was registered to me. So I'm the owner. I bought it when I wanted, sold it when I wanted. What's your beef? So you bought it with someone else's money. David was outraged. And why someone else's? Explain, shook his head father. A relative helped me. A close person. Do you consider him a stranger too? You live in his house, don't you? Aren't you ashamed? So pay back your relative. David tried his best to speak calmly, not reacting to his father's taunts. And you prove that it was a debt. John grinned. There was no debt. It was voluntary contributions. That was nice of the family. There was no debt. At last the men shouted at each other, and their conversation turned into a real quarrel. David achieved nothing for his father-in-law, but firmly promised his father that until Sebastian got his money back, he would not communicate with his father. A great loss. John followed the offspring. That night he called Jenkins and expressed his displeasure. What are you, a matchmaker? You're turning my son against me, he said reproachfully. I thought you were in my position. I agree to wait while I sort out my finances, and you not only started to beat your pennies out of me, but also David against me. I didn't expect that kind of meanness. The conversation was on speakerphone. Sebastian was fiddling with a word at the moment of the call and his hands were dirty. David, hearing his father's complaints, was lazy. How can you have a conscience? He shouted into the phone. You're a liar and a cheat. We'll sue you in court, you say, snorted John. Son against father. But sue over laughing lawyers. And he disconnected. Uncle Sebastian, I think you should really file a complaint against him, David said, in a passionate voice. He won't give the money back in kind. David, What's the point of all this squabbling? Jenkins said sadly. You and your father are going to get in trouble. Honestly, I don't want anything to do with him. After that, he left David with a thread to play on our nerves. Lied to your eyes. Deprived you of your savings. He thought I might lose my beloved wife after such tricks. What are you doing with Miranda? You won't let me in the door. Like hell you wouldn't. He didn't care. I don't want anything to do with him. After that. Don't get hot, David, don't get hot, Sebastian reassured him. Not sure what else to say, but his son-in-law had already decided to act. The firm where David worked as an engineer had a legal department. He went there, described his situation to the staff, and asked them to recommend a good lawyer who could help his family recover a debt from his ex-family. In principle, I could do it, said one of the trust employees, Charles thoughtfully. I've dealt with similar situations before, but I'd have to talk to yours first. I could do it today, the guy said cheerfully. Just Charles, if you need anything. You work for my father-in-law for free. As a friendship, so to speak, and we'll settle the fee issue separately, if we win the case or even bring the court costs from the defendant. Don't worry, smiled the lawyer, but I accept the deal. You don't want to worry the old people. So, they are already worried, sighed David. Charles did not spend too long talking to Jenkins. First of all, he clarified for himself how Sebastian had made the payment on David's loan to his father. When he found out that the money was transferred directly to the mortgage account from Sebastian's card, he was happy. That's great, he exclaimed. This is direct evidence that you transferred funds to the defendant. And not just for nothing, but for specific purposes. Receipts of transfers prove that you participated in the purchase of his apartment, so you're entitled to a share of the sale. Print them out for me, please. Sebastian was hesitant to sue his son-in-law's father. It seemed awkward to him, but his wife and David convinced him. And the man that same evening, with the help of Charles, wrote a pre-trial complaint to John. The document was sent by registered mail, but there was no response from the city. Then Sebastian, again with the assistance of a lawyer, wrote a statement of claim. To it, they enclosed copies of documents on the apartment and the extract from Roserister, found in the network Miranda, and receipts for transfers, and a copy of the claim and a receipt for sending it. The lawyer took all these papers to the district court the next day. Additionally, David attached to the package of documents a flash drive with audio recording of his conversation with his father voice recorder in his phone. He then turned it on just in case. Knowing the character of John, he could agree to something, and a date later refused to retract his words. The guy thought the recording would help him avoid that. He didn't even think about a trial at that time. But the audio came in handy. Charles said it would be another argument in Jenkins' favor. The trial took several months and cost the family a lot of heartache. Kelly and John regularly called the Jenkinses and asked them to settle the case amicably. They offered to wait. They threatened, tried to scandalize. But Sebastian and Miranda were adamant, although the elderly woman often had to take sedatives after such calls. They upset her too much. Miranda was too worried that she couldn't see the true nature of her new relatives in time. Mom, why were you soothing her? Robert, you're not a psychic after all. How could you have known there was so much dirt in them? Exactly. David, I've been around them for years, and I didn't expect this kind of meanness. They're my parents. You don't understand, Jenkins joked. This is a big professional setback for me. I'm a psychologist with a long experience, with a doctorate. And it's unthinkable to misjudge people like this. Psychologist, you've been exhorting on the job, and outside of work. You're an ordinary woman, and like every human being, you have the right to make a mistake. So give yourself permission to exercise it. Miranda nodded, agreed. But each subsequent call threw her off balance. Not for nothing. Oh, not for nothing. She'd been so worried before her first visit for the city's scarecrow of heart to their home. She thought, but all things must come to an end. So did litigation. The Jenkins won the battle. The court ordered John to pay the full amount Sebastian spent on his loan, plus legal fees. It took some more time to fight with the bailiffs, who were supposed to collect the money and return it to its rightful owners. David was already at war with this service. Sebastian had no time to bother the bailiffs on a daily basis, and his health no longer allowed him to perform such active and energetic actions. So David appointed himself the legal representative of his father-in-law. 3 months passed after the court decision came into legal force. When the money finally arrived in the Jenkins account, the message about the deposit was read to Sebastian at dinner and was greeted with applause by the family. "I checked at the bank office, and everything is indeed in order," the man said. "And I was thinking, since we have such a sum, and you have some savings, should we not get involved in the mortgage again? Only now we're going to do it by the book. Miranda and I will give you a down payment. You'll make more of your own, won't you? You'll be able to buy a 2-bedroom. Not as luxurious as in that new building, but quite decent. After all, a young family should live in their own home. Is that what you wanted?" To be honest, Sebastian hesitantly began. "David, we didn't really want to sit around. It was Aunt Kelly who gave me a headache, a vacation, and I'm so into this new apartment. But I actually like it better at home. I'm used to it. And so is David. Not if we're disturbing you." "What are you, Lisa?" Miranda exclaimed. "You're not disturbing us at all, but it's for your convenience." The young couple looked at each other, and there was a certain cunning in their glances. "But if it's for our convenience," said Lisa in a slightly strained voice, "then hold on. For our convenience, it would be better not to move out, but to live together with you, because David and I are going to have a child soon, and we are counting on your help with him." She looked at the changed face of her parents and added in the tone of a mom, "Well, please, I'm afraid that I won't be able to cope with the baby alone. What's the conversation about?" Lisa Sebastian was glowing with happiness. "We'll help you with your grandson. Don't worry. The mother will refuse. I'm still good for something. Why would I refuse?" Miranda smiled. "I'm very much in favor. I'm not used to staying awake at night at the bedside of my loved ones. Just Lisa, for God's sake. Don't send the father to register the baby, and don't send David either. Just in case. Believe me, in my experience, it's a matter for the mother to handle on her own."